Margaret Holloway pointed her finger directly at Eliza Vance in the middle of the general store, in front of every woman in Ash Hollow, and said it loud enough that the words carried out through the open door and into the street. That woman fed poison to a child, no hesitation, no lowered voice, no uncertainty at all, just the flat, certain declaration of someone who had decided the matter was settled. Eliza stood near the counter with a jar of dried herbs in her hands and felt the sentence land like a physical blow. She watched the faces around her shift. She watched the women who had been sitting at her table 3 days ago eating food she had prepared, letting her teach their daughters step backward. Not one of them spoke. Not one. If you have ever stood in a room and felt the floor disappear beneath you without anyone reaching out a hand, you already know what that moment felt like. If you have ever been the person everyone trusted until the moment someone with a louder voice decided you weren't, then this story belongs to you. Stay with us. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one. Hit the like button and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, to the morning Eliza Vance first understood what the land was trying to tell her, and how that understanding would one day save everyone who had laughed at her. The creek that ran through Ash Hollow was not a beautiful creek. It was narrow and brown most of the year, choked in summer with mud and algae, and by late autumn it smelled faintly of sulfur where it curved around the eastern bluffs. Children were told not to play too close to the banks. The water was not clean enough for drinking without boiling, and the vegetation that grew along its edges was considered, by the general agreement of the valley, to be worthless tangle the kind of greenery that existed simply because nothing had thought to remove it. Eliza Vance had been walking those banks since she was 19 years old. She'd come to Ash Hollow as a bride, arriving from a small settlement 2 counties east, where her father had kept a modest homestead and an even more modest library. Her father was not an educated man in any formal sense, but he had possessed the particular kind of intelligence that expressed itself through obsessive, noticing the sort of man who could tell you which direction rain was coming from by the behavior of certain beetles, or which wild greens were safe to eat in early spring before the first proper crops came in. He had taught Eliza everything he knew, not because he believed she would need it necessarily, but because he couldn't help himself. Knowledge, to her father, was something you passed on, the way you passed on a tool you handed it over, because it was useful and because it was wrong to let it rust. Eliza had married Nathan Vance in the early spring of 1885, and she had liked him well enough from the start. He was not complicated. He worked hard, slept soundly, and did not have strong opinions about most things, which Eliza, who had grown up watching her mother navigate around. Her father's very strong opinions about nearly everything, considered a considerable virtue. Nathan had brought her to Ash Hollow, with the understanding that they would build something here. He had 40 acres of decent bottomland, a one-room house that he was already adding to, and the kind of quiet determination that Eliza recognized as the foundation everything else gets built on. What he had not anticipated was that his wife would immediately take an intense interest in the creek. The first time she came home from a morning walk with her apron full of green things he didn't recognize, he had asked her, politely, what she intended to do with them. Eat some, dry some. Learn the rest, she said. Learn what about them? Which ones come back in drought? Which ones the insects don't touch? Which ones you can store? Nathan had looked at the tangled mass of greenery in her apron and said nothing. He was at heart a man who trusted outcomes over theory, and the outcome of Eliza's plant gathering had not yet revealed itself. So he waited. The valley did not wait. Ash Hollow in 1885 was not a wealthy place, but it was a functional one. 37 families farming bottomland and hillside pasture, 2 general stores that between them carried most of what anyone needed, a small schoolhouse that doubled as a meeting hall, and the kind of tight social weave that develops naturally when people depend on each other through hard seasons. The community had its hierarchies, the way every community does. At the top of the invisible ladder sat the families who had been there longest and produced the most. The Holloways were near that top. Margaret Holloway's husband, Charles, had arrived in Ash Hollow 15 years earlier and had built up a substantial wheat operation on the valley's best flatland. Margaret herself was the kind of woman who organized things. Church committees, community gatherings, the distribution of charity when families fell on hard times. She was not cruel, exactly. She simply had a very clear picture in her mind of how a proper community functioned, and she watched the edges of that picture carefully for anything that threatened its integrity. A young wife who wandered creek banks collecting weeds was, by Margaret's accounting, a minor embarrassment to the community. Not dangerous, just slightly undignified. Eliza was aware of how she was perceived. She had been aware of it since the first spring, when she'd come home from the creek with her apron full of lamb's quarter and wood sorrel, and found two of the neighboring wives standing in her yard, ostensibly visiting, but actually, she understood, checking on things. One of them, a woman named Phyllis Dodd, whose husband farmed the parcel just north of the Vances, had looked at the greens in Eliza's hands and made a small, involuntary sound of distaste. "You're not going to eat those," Phyllis said. It wasn't quite a question. "They're lamb's quarter," Eliza said. "Good with a little fat and salt. Better than spinach, if you know what you're doing with them." Phyllis looked at the other woman. The other woman looked at Phyllis. "Nathan doesn't mind?" Phyllis asked. And Eliza had understood in that moment what the real question was. The real question was whether Nathan Vance knew what his wife was doing and whether he approved of it. The real question was whether Eliza had a husband who could control her, or whether the Vance household was going to be that kind of household, the kind that didn't understand how things were supposed to be done. "Nathan eats what I put on the table," Eliza said. "Same as every other husband." She smiled when she said it, which softened the words but didn't retract them. Word spread as it does, not maliciously at first. Just the ordinary transmission of information between people living close together who find each other's lives interesting. By the end of her first summer, Eliza Vance had a reputation as something of an eccentric, not dangerous, not immoral, just odd in a way that made people slightly uncomfortable and occasionally provided something to discuss over evening meals. She didn't mind. The plants didn't care what anyone thought of her. Kept going back to the creek. She kept filling her apron and then her baskets, and then the series of carefully labeled jars that began accumulating on the shelves Nathan built along the back wall of their kitchen. Dried wood sorrel, pickled ramps, pressed and powdered cattail root, wild garlic preserved in oil, a dozen varieties of herb she had learned by name and habit and seasonal behavior over her years on her father's property, and the first years of careful observation here. Nathan watched all of this with the patient uncertainty of a man who has decided to trust someone and is waiting to see whether that trust turns out to be warranted. In the summer of 1886, Ash Hollow had a mild drought. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to stress the crops and thin the yields. Eliza's little kitchen garden, which she watered by hand from the creek when necessary, produced about what it always produced. What she gathered from the creek banks also continued largely unchanged, because wild plants that have adapted to the specific conditions of a place don't need tending the same way cultivated crops do. She noticed that summer that the insects were particularly bad, more than she'd seen before. The kind of striped beetles that destroyed cabbages and leafy greens had come through twice and were thick along the fence rows. She killed what she could in her own garden and said nothing, because saying something wasn't useful without knowing what to say. She went back to the creek. She started paying attention to which plants the beetles avoided completely. There were more of them than she expected, not just the bitter or strong-smelling plants that any experienced gardener might have guessed, but some that looked identical to things the beetles ate freely. She began marking those plants. She began, in her careful, methodical way, building a second category of knowledge on top of the first, not just what grows wild and how to use it, but what grows wild and survives even when the worst things come. Nathan had noticed her taking notes now. She had a small book, not a proper journal, just a section of blank pages she'd sewn into a cover from an old flour sack, where she made entries in her small, careful handwriting. He picked it up one evening while she was outside and looked at a page and put it back down. Because it was dense with information he didn't have the background to interpret, and he was not the kind of man who read other people's private things. "You're writing all this down," he said when she came inside. "I want to remember it right. What for?" She thought about that for a moment. She was standing at the dry sink, washing the dirt from her hands, and she looked up at him and said, "Because things change, Nathan. And when they do, you want to have paid attention." He didn't say anything. He would tell people later, ever entirely certain what she was talking about. But he had learned by then to let her have her methods. The spring of 1887 came wet and cool, which the valley generally considered a good sign. The soil held moisture. The seedlings came up strong. By early summer, the crops in Ash Hollow were looking better than they had in 3 years, and the mood in the community had lifted accordingly. Eliza was 23 that spring. She had no children yet, which was a fact people noticed, and occasionally commented on in ways that were meant to be kind, but weren't entirely. She spent her mornings at the creek banks, and her afternoons preserving, drying, and cataloging, and her evenings cooking for Nathan and helping him with the bookkeeping that he had never been comfortable with. She was, by most measurable standards, a good wife and a productive member of the household. She was simply also doing something that nobody understood, and that made people vaguely uneasy, because things people don't understand tend to make people vaguely uneasy. Margaret Holloway's opinion of Eliza had not changed. If anything, it had solidified into something firmer than mere disapproval, into a kind of settled certainty that the Vance woman was an example of what happened when young wives weren't properly guided into understanding their place in community life. Margaret wasn't unkind about it. She was simply clear, in the way only very certain people can be. She was right, and that Eliza was, in some fundamental way, doing it wrong. The two women were not enemies. They were barely acquaintances. They attended the same community gatherings. They were pleasant enough when they passed each other, and they never exchanged a significant word. That would change. Everything would change. It began in August when the beetles came. Not the ordinary summer beetles, the ones that nicked leaves and damaged a row or two, and could be managed with enough effort. These were different. These were the kind of emergence that happened. Old-timers said, once or twice in a generation, a mass hatching event, triggered by some combination of soil temperature and rainfall and conditions that no one in Ash Hollow had the knowledge to predict or explain. They came from the ground in numbers that seemed impossible. They came in waves. They stripped leaves with an efficiency that was almost mechanical. In 3 days, most of the valley's cabbage was gone. In 5 days, the bean crop was devastated. By the end of the first week, the potato plants had been so thoroughly attacked that farmers were digging early desperately to try to salvage what tubers were already formed, before the plants died completely and left them with nothing. Eliza stood at the edge of her small garden on the 6th morning and watched the beetles work their way through the last of her winter squash. She had done everything she could. It wasn't enough. Nothing any of them had done was enough. Nathan came to stand beside her. He looked at the garden, and then he looked at her. "How bad is it?" he asked, though he already knew. "The garden is gone," she said. "The cultivated crops are gone. Most of the valley's stores are either destroyed or going to be damaged before this breaks." He was quiet for a moment. "So we're going to be short this winter. Most people in this valley are going to be short this winter," she said. "Very short." Nathan looked across the ruined rows. He had worked that soil since before he married. He knew every inch of it. Watching it stripped bare had produced in him a feeling he didn't have precise words for, a kind of cold, hollow wrongness, like discovering a room in your own house you'd never known existed. "What are we going to do?" he asked. Eliza picked up her basket. "Come with me," she said. She took him to the creek. She walked slowly, because she wanted him to see everything, and she talked as she walked. She named plants as she pointed to them. She explained which ones were edible, and in what form, and what they tasted like, and what they provided in terms of nutrition. She showed him the cattails, the roots starchy and dense, the pollen usable as flower supplement, the young shoots edible in spring. She showed him the wood sorrel, bright and lemony, and the lamb's quarter, which she'd been harvesting for 2 years, and which grew in such abundance along the northern stretch of the bank that even feeding a dozen families wouldn't make a dent in it. She showed him the things the beetles had not touched. She showed him that food was here, not the food they'd planned on, not the food they'd worked for, but food present and real and waiting. Nathan was quiet for a long time after she stopped talking. "How long have you known about all this?" he finally asked. "Since the 2nd year," she said. "And you've been collecting it? And studying it?" "Yes." He looked at the creek banks, at the green tangle he'd walked past 100 times without seeing, and Eliza watched him processing. Something watched the expression on his face go through several changes that she couldn't entirely read. She wasn't sure if he was going to be grateful or embarrassed, because sometimes those two things looked identical on men like Nathan. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. It was not an accusatory question. He genuinely wanted to know. "I did tell you," she said. "You watched me take notes. You knew I was doing this." "I knew you were gathering plants," he said. "I didn't understand it, was I didn't realize you were building something." Eliza looked at the water moving slowly over the stones at the creek's center. "Thought I was just wandering." He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. She wasn't angry. Not exactly. She had lived long enough with the reality of how she was perceived by Nathan, by the valley, by the world, that had its clear picture of what a woman was supposed to be doing with her mornings, to have stopped expecting to be understood before she was needed. The expectation now was simpler: be needed. The Dodds have 3 children, she said. The Hendersons have 5. The Prothers have a baby that's going to need more than any of them have stored once December comes. She looked at Nathan directly. We could keep this to ourselves. We could manage the winter. He held her gaze, or he said. Or I open the house, she said, and I start teaching. He took a long breath. He looked at the creek. He looked at his wife. And then, and this was the thing Eliza never forgot, the thing she would come back to in every hard moment that followed. Nathan Vance nodded. Not enthusiastically. Not without his own complicated set of feelings about it. But he nodded, and he said, all right, we open the house. It was the beginning of everything. The first woman to come was Ruth Prather, who had a baby and an 8-month store of flour that had been half destroyed when the beetles got into the grain sacks she'd left improperly sealed in the barn. Ruth had 3 other children under 6, and her husband had gone to the county seat 2 weeks earlier and was not yet back. And she was standing in Eliza's doorway with red eyes and the carefully controlled expression of a woman who was determined not to cry in someone else's house. Eliza brought her inside and made her tea. She didn't start with instruction. She started with the tea, and with sitting across the table from Ruth and letting the silence stretch until Ruth was ready to let it go. I heard you might know, Ruth started and then stopped, because asking for help was harder than most things. I do know, Eliza said, and I'm going to show you. She took Ruth to the creek that afternoon. She brought her back with a full basket. She sat with her in the kitchen while they cleaned and prepared what they'd gathered, and she explained every step in plain language, without condescension, without the slight elevation of tone that women sometimes used with each other when one of them knew something the other didn't. Ruth stayed until almost dark. When she left, she took food with her. She also took the knowledge of how to find more. 2 days later, Ruth came back. She brought Phyllis Dodd. Phyllis Dodd, who had made the small involuntary sound of distaste at Eliza's apron full of lamb's quarter 2 years earlier, stood in Eliza's kitchen and listened to everything. Eliza said with the careful attention of a woman who revised her position on something and is too proud to say so out loud, but not too proud to do what needs doing. By the end of the first week, Eliza was going to the creek in a group of 6 women and their children. By the end of the second week, the number had more than doubled. Taught them to identify. She taught them to harvest sustainably, taking only what could be taken without damaging the plant's ability to recover. She taught them to dry spread thin in the shade, turned regularly to prevent mold. She taught them to pickle, using the vinegar most households had in quantity. She taught them to pound cattail root into a rough flour substitute that wasn't good for much, but was genuinely filling. Taught them which plants were safe for young children and which ones required care. She made everyone taste everything she was teaching them about. That was the rule she'd established from the beginning. Instinctively, she would never ask anyone to feed something to their family that she hadn't eaten herself, in front of them, first. It was a rule that would matter later. The men were the problem. Not all of them. There were a few who came quietly to ask questions when their wives weren't there to witness it, who listened and learned and never mentioned it to anyone else. But the majority of the men in Ash Hollow responded to the news of Eliza's lessons with something ranging from mild embarrassment to active contempt. The embarrassment Eliza understood. These were men who had built their identities around their ability to provide. The destruction of their crops had already been a blow to something in them that went beyond finances, a blow to the sense of competency that they organized their self-understanding around. Now they were supposed to accept that the young woman they'd considered peculiar for 2 years had been quietly building exactly the knowledge they needed while they'd been doing things the way they'd always been done. That was not comfortable. The contempt was harder. Bernard Coles, a tall man with a wheat farm and opinions he was never shy about sharing, stood at the community well one afternoon while several women were filling buckets and announced loudly that any family eating creekbank weeds was no better than desperate beggars, and he for one intended to write to his brother-in-law in St. Louis about the possibility of a loan before he'd let his wife go mucking about in creek mud. Several of the women looked away. Eliza was not there, but she heard about it before nightfall. Thought about it. She thought about what it would feel like to confront Bernard Coles directly, to tell him exactly what she thought of a man who would choose pride over his family's winter provisions. She thought about it in detail, actually, and the feeling was satisfying in the way that imagined confrontations usually are. Put it away. He wasn't the audience, his wife was. His wife, a quiet woman named Agnes, had come to Eliza's third teaching afternoon without telling her husband. She had stood at the back of the group and said almost nothing and absorbed everything with the focused attention of someone who understood perfectly well that what she was learning might matter in December, even if her husband hadn't figured that out yet. Eliza had caught Agnes's eye at one point during that afternoon and had given her a small, acknowledging nod. Nothing more. But Agnes had understood it. There were other resistances, smaller and stranger than Bernard Coles's trumpet blast of contempt. A man who told his children they weren't allowed to attend the creek walks because it wasn't proper. A woman who refused to come herself but sent her eldest daughter and then pretended not to know about it. A husband who showed up one afternoon, not to learn anything, but to stand at the edge of the group with his arms crossed and watch, in a way that was meant to be intimidating, and wasn't quite. Eliza continued teaching. She was not patient in the saintly, uncomplicated sense that word sometimes implies. She got frustrated. There were evenings she sat at the kitchen table with Nathan and said things she wouldn't have said to anyone else about certain specific people in the valley and what she thought of them. Nathan listened and occasionally agreed, and occasionally said things that made her laugh, which was one of the things she valued about him. His particular brand of dry observation, delivered without build-up, kept teaching, because the calendar was moving. Late August had become September. The nights were cooling. First light frosts were still weeks away, but the season was shortening, and what could be gathered now was different from what would be available in October, and what remained in October was not what December would offer. The pace of the teaching sessions had increased accordingly. Eliza was running 3 or 4 sessions a week by mid-September. She was also spending her own mornings in intensive preservation work, filling jars, filling crocks, hanging herbs to dry from every available surface in the kitchen, until Nathan said it looked like they were livings inside a botanical collection, which was not precisely a complaint. She was also in the back of her mind calculating. She had a general sense of how many families had been receiving food directly, how many had been learning and gathering on their own, and how many were sitting in their damaged farmhouses, hoping that the situation would resolve itself through means that weren't becoming clearer as the weeks passed. That last group worried her. She talked to Nathan about it one evening in late September. They were sitting on the porch after supper, the air finally cool enough to be comfortable after the long, brutal heat of the summer. "There are families who aren't coming," she said. "I know," Nathan said. "Coles isn't going to come. There are 3 or 4 others whose won't. They might come when they get hungry enough. November might be too late for some of what I could teach them now," she said. Nathan was quiet. He understood what she was saying, that knowledge about foraging wasn't just about the knowing, it was also about the doing. And the doing required time and practice that couldn't be compressed into desperation in November. "Can't make them come," he said. "I know. And you can't go door to door. I know that too." What she could do, what she had been doing, quietly, without making a point of it, was talk to the women who had been coming. Not to recruit, specifically. Just to talk. The way people who have shared something real together talk about it afterward. To make it ordinary. To make it the kind of thing that you could mention to your neighbor without it being a declaration of anything. It was slow work, but slow work was the only kind that lasted. The thing Eliza didn't yet know, in those early October days, was that there was a piece of all this she hadn't anticipated. She had anticipated the resistance. She had anticipated the mockery and the social friction and the particular brand of pride that would keep some families from accepting help they needed. She had planned carefully for the practical difficulties. She had not planned for the fact that her growing influence in the community would produce, in one specific person, something that went beyond mere disapproval into something that felt, though Margaret Holloway would never have used this word, like threat. And she had not planned for the boy who was about to get sick. Thomas Pierce was 8 years old, the second son of James and Clara Pierce, who farmed the Upper Valley acreage near the bluffs. He was not a child Eliza knew particularly well. She knew most of the valley's children by sight and name. But Thomas was a quiet boy who stayed close to home, and she had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with him in 3 years. He had attended 2 of Eliza's creek walks with his mother. He had eaten some of what she'd taught Clara to prepare. And in the 3rd week of October, he developed a high fever that frightened everyone who saw him. Eliza didn't know about Thomas until the morning she walked into the general store and found Margaret Holloway standing by the counter, talking to 2 other women in the low, deliberate voice that Eliza had come to recognize over her years in the valley as the voice of someone making a point that was meant to travel. She caught only a fragment before the voices dropped. The fragment was enough. The boy ate something from her gathering lessons, and now Margaret looked up and met Eliza's eyes. And Eliza saw in that look something she had not expected. Not triumph, not malice, exactly. Something older and more complicated than either of those, something that looked strangely like relief. As if Margaret Holloway had been waiting, without knowing it, for something like this to arrive. As if the rumor she was building had been taking shape in her for years, looking for the right moment to emerge. Eliza stood very still. She held the jar of dried herbs in her hands. She did not look away. And then Margaret said it, at full volume, for the room, that woman fed poison to a child. The silence that followed Margaret Holloway's words was not the ordinary silence of a room where conversation has briefly paused. It was the particular thick silence of a space where everyone present has simultaneously decided not to be the first to speak. Eliza counted 4 women in the store besides Margaret. She knew all of them by name. She had taught 3 of them how to identify lamb's quarter. She had sat at the same rough table with Ruth Prather and spent an afternoon showing her the difference between wood sorrel and the similar-looking plant that caused stomach upset. She had watched Phyllis Dodd transform from a woman who made small sounds of distaste into someone who came to the creek with her daughters twice a week. Now all 4 of them were looking at the floor, or at the jars on the counter behind Samuel Webb's head, or at the particular middle distance that people look at when they have decided not to witness something. Samuel Webb, who owned and ran the general store and who was a generally decent man in most circumstances, was looking at the jar of dried thyme on the shelf directly behind Eliza's left ear. Eliza set the herbs she'd come to purchase on the counter. She did it carefully, without noise. She looked at Margaret. Margaret looked back. There was something Eliza had understood about Margaret Holloway from fairly early in her years in Ash Hollow, something she'd never said aloud to anyone, not even Nathan, because it was the kind of observation that sounded uncharitable even when it was accurate. Margaret was not stupid. Margaret was, in her particular way, quite intelligent. She read situations correctly and acted on them with precision, and she had a genuine talent for identifying what people were afraid of and speaking directly to that fear. What she lacked was the ability to be wrong about anything and still remain standing. That was the vulnerability if Eliza was reading it correctly. A woman who cannot absorb being wrong becomes increasingly committed to never being wrong, and the mechanisms she builds to protect that position get more elaborate over time. None of which helped Eliza right now, standing in a general store with the accusation still hanging in the air, and 4 women studying their own shoes. Thomas Pierce has a fever, Eliza said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Where did you hear he ate something from my lessons? Clara Pierce said so herself, Margaret answered. When yesterday morning. She came to me quite distressed. Eliza looked at her. She thought about Clara Pierce, a woman she liked actually, a quiet and practical woman who had been one of the more attentive students at the creek walks. She tried to put Clara together with the phrase distressed, and with came to Margaret, and the combinations produced a picture that wasn't quite right. Clara was not the type to run to Margaret Holloway. Clara was the type to handle things quietly and ask for help only when she had exhausted every other option. I'll go see Clara myself, Eliza said. She picked up the dried herbs and walked to where Samuel Webb was still studying the thyme jar and paid for what she needed. Margaret said nothing else. Eliza could feel the woman's eyes on her back as she left, but she didn't turn around. She walked home first. She needed 10 minutes with herself before she went anywhere, and she had learned over years of being herself to respect that need rather than ignore it. She went to the kitchen, set the herbs down, and stood at the dry sink, looking at the wall and running back through the conversation in her mind with the particular kind of attention she gave to situations that needed to be understood correctly before they could be addressed. The accusation was clear. A child was sick. Margaret had already moved to connect the sickness to Eliza's teaching, had done it publicly, at volume, in a place where several women would carry the words in every direction before nightfall. The evidence was nothing. The accusation was everything. And the thing about a rumor moving at that speed was that you could not outrun it by being right. You could only control where you stood when it finally stopped. Nathan was in the south field when she came out of the house. Called to him, and he walked over, and she told him what had happened in the store. She told it straight, without additional color, because Nathan would be able to assess it better without additional color. He listened without interrupting. How sick is the boy? He asked when she finished. I don't know yet. I'm going to see Clara. He looked toward the road. You want me to come? She thought about it. Having Nathan beside her would look like defense, like she was bringing support because she needed it. That wasn't the posture she wanted. No, she said. I'll go alone. He put a hand on her arm briefly. It was not a gesture he made often, and she registered it. Be careful with Clara. She's scared, I know, Eliza said. She walked the 1.5 miles to the Pierce property in a brisk late October wind that carried the smell of rain coming. The fields on either side of the road showed the damage from August the Brown and collapsed remains of what had been a decent crop. Year before the beetles, the bare patches where things had been stripped completely. Pierce House was a solid 2-story structure, better built than most in the valley, because James Pierce had done the construction himself over 2 years before marrying Clara. Clarice answered the door almost immediately, as though she'd been waiting near it, and Eliza saw in her face the specific expression of a woman who has been crying and is trying not to show it, but is too tired to fully succeed. Come in, Clara said. Her voice was rough. They sat at the kitchen table. Clara's hands were folded in front of her, and she pressed them together in a way that was clearly meant to stop them from shaking. How is Thomas? Fever's up, Clara said. James went for the doctor this morning. Earliest he can get here is tomorrow. Can I see him? Clara hesitated 1 full second, which was long enough for Eliza to understand everything the hesitation contained. I'm not there to examine him, Eliza said quietly. I just want to see how he looks. He looks terrible, Clara said. And then something in her face cracked, just slightly at the edges. At your lessons. He ate the things you showed us. Eliza didn't move. He did, she said. So did you. So did a dozen other families in this valley, including my own husband and me. I know, Clara said. Are any of them sick? Clara pressed her hands tighter together. Not that I've heard, Clara. Eliza kept her voice even. Has Thomas been near anyone else who's been ill? Has he been in water? Has he been outside in the cold without enough on? He's a boy, Clara said. He's always outside without enough on. When did the fever start? 3 days ago. Eliza did the calculation quietly. 3 days ago meant the fever had begun roughly 4 days after the last creek walk Thomas had attended, which was not consistent with a rapid onset food reaction. Everything she knew about the plants she taught said the effects, if there were any, would appear within hours, a day at most. She knew this. But knowing it and demonstrating it to a frightened mother sitting across a kitchen table were 2 entirely different problems. She said, What did he eat specifically that day? Clara looked at her for a long moment. Her eyes were red. She was exhausted in the specific way that parents get exhausted when a child is ill, not just physically, but in some deeper register, the way your body deploys every resource toward anxiety and leaves nothing else. Wood sorrelful, she said. Some of the dried lamb's quarter from what you prepared for us. Part of a cattail root cake. Did he eat anything else that day? Whatever James and I ate. And neither of you are sick. No. Eliza folded her own hands on the table and looked at them for a moment. I need to take you somewhere this afternoon. If you're willing. Clara looked up. Where Eleanor Whitmore's? Something shifted in Clara's expression. Everyone in the valley knew Eleanor Whitmore. She was 73 years old, had arrived in Ash Hollow as a young woman, had buried one husband, and outlasted the expectations of everyone who had predicted she'd leave after he died, and had accumulated the kind of authority that doesn't come from position or wealth, but simply from being right more often than not for a very long time. Why Eleanor? Clara asked. Because she's been in this valley longer than any of us, Eliza said. And because if there's something she recognizes in what you're describing, I'd rather know it than not. The walk to Eleanor's was quiet. Clara kept pace beside her, not speaking. The wind had picked up, and there were gray clouds moving in from the northwest, in the particular formation that usually meant rain within the day. Eliza had learned to read the sky here in much the same way she'd learned the creek, not from any formal instruction, but from sustained attention over years. Eleanor Whitmore answered the door before they knocked, which was her way. She had a particular sensitivity to movement near her property that she claimed was just old habit, and that people who were not old enough to know better attributed to something more mysterious. Eliza, she said. Then she saw Clara Pierce, come in out of that wind. Eleanor's house was small and organized with the specific precision of someone who lives alone and has thought carefully about where everything goes. There were jars on her shelves, too, a different set than Eliza's, gathered by different hands over many more years, but the same essential impulse, the knowledge of the land, preserved. Eleanor listened to Clara's account of Thomas's illness without interrupting. She was a listener the way certain people are not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually receiving the information, filing it. When Clara finished, Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the table. High fever, she said, coming on fast. Boy's been outside. Yes, Clara said. Has he been near the Forsyth property at all recently? The Upper Creek Bend? Clara looked confused. Not that I know of. Why? Eleanor looked at Eliza, then back at Clara. 30 years ago in this valley, there was a fever that moved through the children in October. Came on fast, ran high, and worried everyone half to death. My own sister's boy had it. Clara went very still. It was a seasonal thing, Eleanor continued. Something in the air near the upper creek when the water table drops and the ground releases whatever's in it. Never could say exactly what caused it. Came back every few years, usually hit children hardest, usually broke within a week. Was it? Clara's voice had dropped to almost nothing. Was it ever from something they ate? Not once, Eleanor said flatly. I have lived in this valley since I was 22 years old, and I have watched that fever come and go 5 times. It has never not once had anything to do with food. The room held that for a moment. Clara looked at Eliza. Eliza did not say anything. This was not her moment to speak. I need to get back to him, Clara said finally. Of course you do, Eleanor said. When the doctor comes tomorrow, tell him the Upper Creek exposure angle. He'll know what to look at. They walked Clara to the door. She was moving differently, still frightened, still exhausted, but with something slightly lightened in her carriage, as though she'd set down a weight she'd been carrying since she picked up a different one. She was almost to the road when she stopped and turned back. Margaret came to me, she said, 2 days ago. She said she'd heard the other families were getting worried, that maybe the things Eliza was teaching she stopped. I didn't say she poisoned my boy. I said Thomas was sick and he'd eaten from the lessons. That's all I said. Eliza looked at her steadily. I know. Clara held her gaze for a moment. Then she turned and walked toward home. Eleanor stood beside Eliza and they watched her go. Well, Eleanor said, in the dry tone of a woman who has watched people navigate difficult situations for 5 decades. Margaret Holloway has made something of a leap, it seems. She had help, Eliza said. She had a scared mother and a sick child in the right moment. What are you going to do? Eliza thought about it honestly. The honest answer was that she didn't entirely know yet. She knew what she wasn't going to do. She wasn't going to stand in public places and defend herself loudly, because that transformed a rumor into a debate, and debates, in her experience, went to whoever had more volume rather than whoever had more evidence. Keep teaching, she said. Eleanor made a sound that might have been approval or might have been skepticism. With Eleanor, it was sometimes hard to tell, which Eliza had always respected. Come in, Sitzler said. I'll make tea, and you'll tell me what you've been finding at the creek this season, because I haven't been mobile enough to walk those banks since spring, and I'm curious. They sat at Eleanor's kitchen table for the better part of an hour. Eliza talked about the plants, the yields, the varieties, the surprising abundance of certain things she hadn't expected in a dry summer. Eleanor listened and occasionally corrected or expanded, adding knowledge accumulated over decades that Eliza didn't have. It was not the conversation either of them had expected to be having that afternoon, but it was, Eliza thought, exactly the right one. She walked home in the early dark, the wind carrying the first drops of the rain that had been threatening all day. Nathan was on the porch when she got back. He had a lamp lit and a look on his face that meant he'd heard something while she'd been gone. Bernard Coles was at the well, he said, which covered most of what he needed to explain. Already, she said. Word moves fast when people are scared. He held the door for her. Agnes came by while you were out. She left something. On the kitchen table was a cloth-covered basket. Eliza lifted the cloth. Inside was a careful selection of wild herbs, some fresh, some already dried that she recognized from the lessons, gathered with more skill than Agnes had shown even a month ago. There was no note. Agnes Coles was not the kind of woman who left notes. The basket was there. Eliza looked at it for a long time. Then she began preparing supper, because the work continued regardless. What she didn't know yet, and wouldn't know for several more days, was that the rumor was already further along than she realized. Margaret Holloway had not stopped at the general store. She had been speaking to people for 2 days before Eliza had walked into that store quietly, carefully, in the particular way that meant the words were already distributed across the valley like seeds, before anyone thought to examine whether the ground needed them. The first sign came the next morning, when Ruth Prather did not arrive at the creek at the usual time. Ruth had been consistent. In 6 weeks of teaching sessions, she had missed one morning due to her youngest being ill, and she had sent her eldest daughter in her place. Missing without explanation was not Ruth's way. Eliza waited an extra half hour at the gathering point by the old willow, the tree she'd started using as a landmark because everyone knew it. 3 other women were there. All 3 were quieter than usual. "Has anyone seen Ruth?" Eliza asked. The 3 women exchanged a look that Eliza recognized as the look of people who know something and are deciding whether to say it. Phyllis Dodd, who had come a long way from her early disapproval, and who had enough honesty in her to be direct when it mattered, said, "She got a letter. Anonymous. Saying she should think about what she's been feeding her children." Eliza absorbed that. "When?" "Yesterday evening, I heard." "Is she frightened?" "Wouldn't you be?" Phyllis said. "She has 4 children, Eliza. She's alone with them while James is away. And now someone's telling her she might have been poisoning them." Eliza looked at the creek, at the lamb's quarter growing green and thick, along the banks, indifferent to all of it. "The food is safe," she said. "I know that," Phyllis said. "I know. But she's scared, and scared people don't think straight." 2 days later, the second letter arrived. Not at Ruth's house. Eliza's. Nathan brought it in from the door and held it for a moment before handing it to her. He didn't say anything about his face while he held it, but Eliza could see that the envelope had been sitting on the front step rather than being delivered by hand, which said something about the courage of whoever had written it. The handwriting was uneven, anonymous. It said in 3 sentences that Eliza Vance was feeding the valley poison in the name of teaching, that a child had already been harmed, and that decent families would do well to stay away from both the woman and her lessons. Eliza read it once. She set it on the table. Nathan was watching her. "I'm going to go talk to James Henderson," he said. James Henderson was one of the men who'd been resistant to Eliza's lessons, but whose wife had quietly continued attending. "And to Frank Prather's brother." "Don't," Eliza said. "Eliza, going to confront people won't fix this. It'll make them dig in." He looked at the letter on the table. He was angry in the particular, contained way that Nathan held anger. It didn't change his voice or his face much, but it was visible in his shoulders, in the set of his jaw. "So we do nothing. We do the right thing," she said, which is different from nothing. She had been thinking, since leaving Eleanor's house 2 days earlier, about a specific course of action. It was not dramatic. It did not involve confrontations or declarations, or the kind of public stand that Nathan, in his protective impulse, would have preferred. It was quieter than that, and she thought that was probably exactly right. It was going to Eleanor's for tea, not once, regularly. She was going to sit at Eleanor Whitmore's table and eat the wild plants she'd been teaching in Eleanor's presence, and she was going to do it openly enough that people would know. She was doing it, and she was going to let Eleanor's history in this valley speak to whatever the food was and was not. "It's your plan," Nathan said when she explained it. "Part of it. And the other part? Wait for the doctor to see Thomas." "Thought about that. The doctor might not clear you specifically. The doctor confirms that Thomas has the seasonal fever Eleanor described. That's clearing enough." Nathan was quiet. He pulled out a chair and sat down at the table. He looked at the letter and then pushed it to the edge of the table, as though putting it farther away made it less real. "I don't know if I agree with you," he said finally. "I know, but I'll trust you on it." He looked at her. "I want you to know that. Whatever you decide, I'll back it." It was not, Eliza reflected later, the most effusive speech she'd ever heard from her husband. She knew what it cost him, knew that his instinct was to act, and that choosing to trust her judgment instead of his own impulse was genuinely difficult for him. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it completely. The 3rd letter arrived at the Miller household, who had been among the most faithful attendees of Eliza's sessions, and whose 3 daughters had become remarkably skilled at identifying plants along the creek. Donna Miller came to Eliza's door the morning after receiving it, carrying it in her hand and looking more furious than frightened. "Someone is doing this deliberately," Donna said. She was a square-built woman in her early 30s who had grown up on a hardscrabble farm further north and had very little patience for anything she identified as nonsense. "These letters aren't scared neighbors. Someone is writing them on purpose." "I think so too," Eliza said. "Then why aren't you doing something about it?" Eliza looked at her steadily. "What would you have me do?" "Say something publicly. Go to the well and stand there and say it straight out." "And then what?" "Margaret or whoever is writing these responds. And we have a fight. And in a fight, the louder side wins." Donna folded her arms. "Margaret Holloway doesn't scare me." "She's not trying to scare you," Eliza said. "She's trying to scare the people who are halfway between believing her and believing me. People in the middle. That's who she's writing to." Donna was quiet. She wasn't happy, but she was thinking. "So what do we do?" she asked. Keep going to the creek, Eliza said. Keep gathering. Keep teaching your daughters. Let them see that you're not afraid. And if more people stop coming, Eliza thought about the winter, about the stores they'd built over these weeks and the ones that hadn't been built, about the families that would be comfortable and the ones that would be short. Then they stop coming, she said. I can't force anyone, but I can make sure the information is available when they're ready for it. Donna made a sound of frustrated resignation. You're a maddening woman, Eliza Vance. I've been told, Eliza said. After Donna left, the morning felt very quiet. Eliza stood in the kitchen and listened to the silence and tried to assess honestly where things stood. 3 families had stopped attending. Ruth still hadn't come back. The letters were continuing, which meant that whoever was writing them believed they were working, which meant they probably were working to some degree. Sessions that had run to 12 and 15 people were now running to 6 or 8, and even those who were still coming were quieter, more watchful, slower to ask questions. The damage to what she'd built was real. She wasn't going to tell herself otherwise. She was also not going to tell herself it was irreparable, because she had sat in Eleanor Whitmore's kitchen and been told, by a woman who had been in this valley for 50 years, that the fever was real and recurring and had nothing to do with food. The doctor was coming. The truth had not changed, but truth, she had learned, did not move at the same speed as fear. Picked up her basket. She went to the creek. The lamb's quarter was still there. Cattails were still there. The wood sorrel, thinning now as the season moved toward its close, still grew in the sheltered bends of the bank where the sun reached. She gathered slowly, alone this morning, because no one had come. And she thought about all the families in Ash Hollow who were watching and waiting to see what happened next, who had not yet decided which way to fall, and she thought about what they needed to see from her in the days ahead. Not defense, not anger, not a declaration. Just this, a woman going about the work, steady, unashamed, carrying her basket along the bank and knowing what she was looking at, in a season when knowing what you were looking at might be the difference between enough and not enough. She worked her way down to the old willow and crouched in the cold mud and pulled Lamb's quarter by the stem, bundling it carefully. Somewhere in the valley, a child was burning with fever, and a woman was writing poison pen letters, and the winter was still coming toward all of them, regardless. Kept gathering. The doctor arrived on a Thursday morning, driving a mud-spattered wagon up the valley road, with the particular unhurried pace of a man who has seen enough emergencies to know that rushing rarely improves outcomes. His name was Dr. Emmett Calhoun, and he served 3 valleys from a practice based in the county seat, which meant he arrived everywhere, slightly late, and knew everyone's business slightly better than anyone was comfortable with. He went to the Pierce house first. Eliza knew he had arrived because Nathan had seen the wagon from the south field, and Nathan had come in to tell her, and they had both sat with that information for a moment without speaking. The doctor's arrival meant that something definitive was about to happen. Either the fever would be identified as something connected to food, in which case the ground was going to drop out from under everything Eliza had built, or it would be identified as something else, in which case the ground would merely continue to be very unsteady. Neither of them said any of this. Nathan went back to the field. Eliza went to the creek. She had been going to the creek every morning regardless, but this particular morning had a different quality to it, a waiting quality, as though the day itself was holding its breath. The wind off the bluffs was colder than it had been, carrying the smell of hard frost coming, and the plants along the bank were beginning to show it. The lamb's quarter was yellowing at the edges. The wood sorrel had thinned to almost nothing. She gathered what was there. She did it methodically, moving from plant to plant, with the same attention she'd brought to this work for 3 years, letting the physical act of it settle her mind somewhat. Not entirely, but somewhat. She was on her way back when she saw Ruth Prather on the road. Ruth was walking with her head down and her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, and she almost didn't see Eliza until they were 10 feet apart. When she looked up, something complicated moved across her face: guilt and relief, and the particular expression of a woman who has been rehearsing what she's going to say and is not sure it's going to come out right. Eliza stopped. Ruth, she said, not a greeting exactly. Just a name. I should have come to you, Ruth said, instead of just not coming. You were scared. I was scared, Ruth agreed. And I got that letter, and I thought. She stopped. Started again. I have 4 children, Eliza. I know. I know you know. Ruth was looking at the basket in Eliza's hands. Then she looked up. But knowing you know doesn't make it easier to be the one who got it wrong. Eliza looked at her steadily. Ruth Prather was not a woman who admitted fault easily. None of the women in the valley were, because admitting fault was a luxury that women who had to be competent at everything in order to keep a household running couldn't often afford. The admission that was happening right now in the middle of a cold road with the frost smell coming off the bluffs was costing Ruth something real. You didn't get it wrong, Eliza said. Someone was trying to scare you. That worked because you're a mother, and mothers are supposed to be scared when someone tells them their children might be in danger. Ruth pressed her mouth together. Her eyes were bright. The food safe? Truly? I have been eating it myself. Every day. For 3 years, Eliza said. Nathan has been eating it. Your children have been eating it for 6 weeks, and not one of them is sick. Thomas Pierce is sick. Thomas Pierce has a fever that's been in this valley since before either of us arrived. Eleanor Whitmore told me herself. The doctor is at the Pierce house right now. Ruth absorbed that. The wind moved between them. Will you come back? Eliza asked. I'm coming tomorrow morning, Ruth said. I'll bring Phyllis if she's willing. Phyllis has been coming every session, Eliza said. Ruth made a small wry sound. Of course she has. She looked down the road toward her own house, then back at Eliza. I'm sorry, don't be sorry, Eliza said. Just come. Ruth nodded once and walked on. Eliza stood in the road a moment longer, looking at nothing in particular. There was a small, complicated feeling moving around in her chest that she did not spend time analyzing. She walked home and put the basket down and started work on the day's preserving. Dr. Calhoun finished at the Pierce house around noon. He made 2 other stops in the valley that afternoon before finding his way, as Eliza had half expected he might, to the Vance property. She heard the wagon on the road and went to the door, and found him climbing down, a compact man in his late 50s with a weathered face and the deliberate movements of someone who has learned to conserve energy. Because there is always more work after this work. Mrs. Vance, he said, which was how he addressed everyone, regardless of how well he knew them. Have a few minutes? Of course, she said. They sat at the kitchen table, which was where every important conversation in her life seemed to happen. She offered tea, he accepted. She waited while he looked around the kitchen at the jars on the shelves, the drying herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, the careful organization of everything. You've been running foraging lessons, he said. I have. How many families? She told him. He listened with his hands wrapped around the tea mug and his eyes on the table. Thomas Pierce has a seasonal fever, he said. I've seen it before in this valley and in the Whitmore Creek area further east. It's not uncommon in children in October when the water table drops. Has nothing to do with what he ate. Eliza said nothing. I'll be making that clear, he continued. To the Pierces directly and to anyone who asks me. He looked up at her. You understand I can't make a public announcement about what a child did or didn't eat. I understand. But I can say, plainly and factually, that the boy's illness has a known cause that I have seen before, and that cause is not any food he consumed. That's enough, Eliza said. He drank some tea. He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone deciding whether to say something additional. I looked at some of what you're teaching, he said. Mrs. Pierce showed me the materials, the plant identifications, the preparation methods. He paused. Careful work. Eliza registered that, but kept her expression neutral. I've been doing it a long time. I know. I heard about you from the Whitmore Valley doctor 2 years ago, actually. He mentioned there was a woman in Ash Hollow who knew the creek plants better than most. I didn't put it together until today. She looked at him. What did he say, that if there was ever a bad season, the people near you were lucky? He set down the mug and stood up. Keep doing what you're doing, Mrs. Vance. He left. Eliza sat at the table alone for several minutes after the sound of the wagon faded. She did not feel relieved exactly. Relief was the feeling you got when something bad had been prevented, and she wasn't sure yet that it had. Something had shifted some pressure that had been building. For the past 10 days had eased slightly, like the first small drop of a barometer before rain actually starts. Problem was that the doctor's opinion, however clear, would move through the valley at the ordinary speed of information, while the rumors Oz Margaret had set in motion were already distributed widely and had been sitting long enough to calcify in some minds. Facts had a way of being less satisfying than stories, especially when the story was frightening and the fact was technical. She was thinking about this when Nathan came in from the field. She told him what the doctor had said. He sat down. He folded his hands on the table. He looked at them for a long moment, and when he looked up, his eyes had a quality she recognized, something resolving, settling, the way a man looks when he has made a decision, and it has produced a specific kind of clarity. I'm going to the well tomorrow, he said. I'm going to say some things. Nathan, I've been quiet, he said, because you asked me to be quiet and I trust your judgment. But there are men in this valley who are going to hear the doctor's report and put it to one side, because some other man with a louder voice has been telling them something different. And I'm not going to sit in this house while that happens. Eliza looked at her husband. She thought about the night he'd agreed to open the house, the way his nod had been slow and complicated but real. She thought about all the mornings he'd watched her walk to the creek without saying the things she could tell. He sometimes wanted to say something about appearances, about how things looked, and hadn't said it, because he was trying to trust what he couldn't entirely see yet. She thought about the fact that he had eaten wild greens at her table, and never complained and never, not even once, told anyone in the valley it bothered him. All right, she said. All right? Say what you need to say, she said. I'm not asking you to be quiet anymore. He held her gaze for a moment, and she saw something change in him, something that had been held under slight pressure for weeks, releasing without drama. Good, he said simply. The next morning was the turning point, though it didn't look like one from inside it. Margaret Holloway had not been idle. Whatever she was feeling about the doctor's report, and Eliza had no direct access to that information. Only inference, she had pivoted with the particular adaptability of someone practiced at maintaining a position when the ground shifts. The direct accusation was no longer the mechanism. The mechanism now was something subtler, a series of questions, raised in the right places, about Eliza's qualifications to be teaching anything to anyone, about whether the valley ought to be, depending on one young woman's knowledge, gathered from wandering creek banks, about whether there might be better sources of guidance available. Eliza heard this through Donna Miller, who had ears everywhere and a low tolerance for people she considered dishonest. She's calling you unqualified now, Donna said, appearing at Eliza's door on a cold Friday morning with her jaw set in the way it got when she was genuinely angry. Now that the poison story isn't holding. I know, Eliza said. She's asking who taught you, whether you've read any proper agricultural or botanical texts, whether your father was a qualified naturalist. Donna said the word qualified with a particular flatness that indicated what she thought of it. My father was a farmer who paid attention, Eliza said. Same as me. That's exactly what she'll say isn't good enough. Eliza handed Donna a mug of coffee and sat across from her. Outside, the first hard frost had come in the night. The ground was white-gray and stiff, and the remaining plants in the kitchen garden had collapsed into the cold. What she's really saying, Eliza said slowly, is that knowledge only counts if someone with authority gave it to you, Donna said, and the people with authority in this valley are her, and the people she approves of. Also, yes. Eliza looked out the window at the frosted yard. She thought about the doctor's visit. She thought about Eleanor Whitmore and the 50 years of knowledge sitting in that small, neat house on the north side of the valley. She thought about the jars on her own shelves and what they represented, not just food, but the patient accumulation of something that had no certificate attached to it and no institution backing it, but was nonetheless real and useful, and specifically suited to this place. Where is she saying this? Eliza asked. Committee meeting for the winter relief planning, Donna said, this afternoon at the schoolhouse. She's involved in organizing the distribution of community stores. Eliza put down her coffee. Who's running that committee? Reverend Alderman is nominally in charge, but Margaret Holloway does all the actual organizing, same as she always does. Is there a list of families who'll need community support this winter? There's meant to be. Is my knowledge being used to help compile that list? The information about what's been gathered. Donna looked at her steadily. It hasn't been asked for. Eliza sat with that for a moment. The committee organizing winter relief, deciding which families had enough, which ones needed supplementing, what the community stores contained and how they'd be distributed, was working without the information. Eliza held about what had been gathered from the creek and what each participating family had stored, which meant they were potentially planning around an incomplete picture, which was, she thought, something she could dress directly and practically without it being about any of the rest of it. I'm going to the meeting, she said. Donna's eyebrows went up slightly. Margaret will be there. I know. It might not go smoothly. No, Eliza agreed. It probably won't. She had never in her years in Ash Hollow attended a community committee meeting. It wasn't that she'd been excluded women served on committees, particularly the charitable and organizational ones, but she'd always been working on other things during meeting times, and Nathan had attended the ones that required a family representative. She understood, walking into the schoolhouse that afternoon, that her presence would be noted, and that some people would read significance into it that she hadn't entirely intended. That was fine. She was beyond managing other people's interpretations at this point. Schoolhouse held about 20 people, which was most of the families who were engaged enough to show up. Margaret Holloway was at the front near the teacher's desk, with a ledger open in front of her and the organized papers of someone who had prepared. Reverend Alderman was seated beside her, a mild man who preferred consensus and generally got it by deferring to whoever in the room had the most clearly formed opinion. Eliza sat in the third row. Several people looked at her when she came in. She could map the different qualities of attention, some surprised, some uncertain, some pointedly neutral. Bernard Coles looked at her from across the room with the expression of a man whose position has been disrupted and who is recalibrating. James Henderson, whose wife had been one of Eliza's steezed attendees, gave her a brief nod, filed that away. Margaret began the meeting with the brisk efficiency that characterized her in any organizational setting. She ran through the categories: grain stores, root cellar inventories, what had been pledged from various families, what the shortfalls were expected to be. She was good at this. Eliza watched her work and felt the complexity of what she was watching: a woman who was genuinely useful in certain ways, who had genuine skills in organization and planning, who was also systematically building a picture of the valley's winter needs that left out a significant category of available food. When Margaret paused for questions, Eliza raised her hand. The room noticed. Margaret looked at her with an expression that was controlled to the point of revealing exactly what it was trying to hide. Mrs. Vance, the list you're compiling, Eliza said. It accounts for stored grain, preserved vegetables from cultivated gardens, dried and salted meats. Has it accounted for what's been gathered from the creek and stored from the wild harvesting? A silence. That's a separate matter, Margaret said. Food, Eliza said. Available this winter to the families who've gathered it. If we're planning community relief based on who has enough, and we're not counting what some families have stored from the lessons, we're going to get an inaccurate picture. I'm not sure how you'd even quantify that, Margaret said. It's not standard stores, I can quantify it, Eliza said. I have records of what each family gathered over 6 weeks of sessions. Not complete records, because people continue gathering on their own, but a starting point. I can give that information to this committee today if it's useful. Another silence, different from the first one. Reverend Alderman, who had been watching this exchange with the expression of a man hoping the weather would improve, said carefully, "That does sound useful, Mrs. Vance." Margaret looked at him. He maintained his position, which was slightly unusual for him. "We would need to know the reliability of what was gathered," Margaret said. Her voice was steady, but Eliza could hear the adjustment happening, the pivot, again, from one angle of attack to another. Given recent concerns about Dr. Calhoun has been to the Pierce house, Eliza said. Thomas is recovering from the seasonal creek fever that Eleanor Whitmore has watched come through this valley 5 times in her years here. The doctor identified it clearly. It has no connection to anything consumed. She said it quietly and without heat, looking at Margaret directly. The room was very still. Bernard Coles shifted in his seat. It was not a large movement, but in the silence it was audible. Margaret looked at Eliza across the room for a moment that felt longer than it was. "If you have records," she said finally, "bring them forward." Eliza stood and walked to the front of the room. She had not brought the flour sack journal, she'd left it at home, deliberately, because bringing it would have felt like bringing a weapon, and she didn't want this to be a battle. She wanted it to be a meeting. But she had numbers in her head, organized by family, compiled from weeks of paying attention. She gave them verbally, clearly, and in the organized way she'd learned from her father's particular brand of methodical intelligence. Family by family, she described what had been gathered and roughly what had been stored, drawing on the direct knowledge she had from the lessons and the secondary knowledge from conversations with the women in the sessions. She was interrupted once by Bernard Coles, who said loudly from across the room, "You're expecting us to count creek weeds as part of the winter plan?" Eliza looked at him. She thought about Agnes's basket, left on her doorstep without a note. "Your wife has been gathering since October, Mr. Coles," she said. "I expect she's already counted it." The room went quiet in a particular way. Not the hostile quiet of earlier, but the quiet of people registering something they hadn't fully registered before. Bernard's face moved through several expressions. He said nothing further. When Eliza sat back down, James Henderson leaned forward from the row behind her and said quietly near her ear, "That took guts." She didn't answer, but she noted it. The meeting continued for another hour. Something had shifted in it, not dramatically, Not in the way that public confrontations shifted things in stories where someone gave a speech and everyone clapped. More quietly, the ledger that Margaret was working from now included a new category, and several of the people in the room were looking at Eliza differently from how they'd looked at her when she walked in. Margaret ran the remainder of the meeting with the same efficiency as always. She was not visibly rattled. She was too practiced for that. Eliza, who had been watching her carefully, saw moments, small moments, a pause in the page turning, a fractional adjustment in the way she held her pen that suggested things were not sitting entirely comfortably. It was not a victory, Eliza was clear on that. It was a data point. One data point in a long argument that was not settled and might not be settled for some time. She walked home in the early dark of late October, the cold coming down hard now, the sky crowded with stars that in Ash Hollow meant a clear, freezing night. She thought about Margaret Holloway. She had been thinking about Margaret with more care lately than the situation might seem to require, because she had started to understand something about what was actually driving the campaign against her, something she hadn't fully grasped when it was just the accusation in the general store, or even the letters. She'd been thinking of it as fear, but that wasn't quite exact. It was fear, yes, but fear of a specific thing. Margaret Holloway had been the person in Ash Hollow who organized, who knew what families needed and coordinated the response, who stood at the center of the web of community knowledge and support. That position had given her life a shape and a purpose that went beyond her household, beyond her husband's farm. It was the thing she was in the world, the organizer, the knowledgeable one, the woman who was consulted. And Eliza Vance had walked into the worst agricultural crisis in a decade and turned out to have quietly and without consulting anyone, built exactly the knowledge this community needed. Not organizational knowledge, practical knowledge, kind that fed people. That was not something Margaret could organize. It was not something she could direct or manage or distribute through her existing systems. It had come from somewhere outside those systems entirely. Eliza thought about this walking home, and she felt something for Margaret that surprised her, not sympathy exactly, because she was too tired and too irritated for the full version of that feeling, but something in the same neighborhood, an understanding of how the situation must look from the inside of Margaret's specific life. It didn't change anything, but it complicated it, and Eliza's preferred complicated to simple when complicated was more accurate. Nathan was waiting up. He'd been to the well that morning, as he'd said, and he'd said what he'd said. Eliza had gotten a version of it from Donna by mid-afternoon. He had stood at the well and told two men, plainly and without particular drama, that his wife had been building knowledge for 3 years that had kept families fed through a beetle infestation, and that anyone who wanted to question that could talk to Dr. Calhoun first, and then come to Nathan. It was not a speech. It was Nathan, which meant it was blunt and brief and did not require a response. She told him about the committee meeting. He listened, and when she finished, he said, "Bernard Coles." He backed down. He does, eventually. He's not actually a hard man. He just sounds like one. Nathan paused. Agnes? She didn't come to the meeting, but she's been gathering. Told him so. Nathan looked at her steadily. How do you feel? Thought about it, honestly. Tired, she said, but not the kind of tired where you've been doing something wrong. The other kind. He nodded. He understood the distinction. Is it getting better? He asked. She considered. I think it might be, she said slowly. But there's still something that could go wrong before it does. She was right about that, and it happened the following week. The letter that came to Eliza's door on Tuesday morning was not anonymous. It was on proper stationery, in Margaret Holloway's firm, upright handwriting, and it said 4 things in 4 sentences. It said that Margaret had spoken to 3 families who had discontinued the lessons and who remained concerned. It said that those families would not be resuming attendance. It said that Margaret intended to propose at the next community meeting that foraging lessons be suspended pending a review by the county agricultural officer. And it said that Margaret hoped Eliza would understand this was done out of concern for the valley's welfare. Eliza read it 3 times. She set it on the table, next to where Nathan was eating breakfast, and watched him read it. His jaw tightened. He set it down. She's going official, he said. She's going to try to, Eliza said. The county agricultural officer isn't going to shut down a foraging program that's been feeding people through a crop failure. No, Eliza said, but the proposal alone will create uncertainty. And uncertainty right now is enough to keep people away. She had been standing while she said all this, and she sat down now, and the two of them looked at the letter on the table in the quiet of early morning. What Eliza was thinking, what she was working through with the same methodical care she applied to plant identification, was the specific nature of the moment. Margaret had formalized things. She'd moved from whisper to stationary, from rumor to proposal. That was either a sign that she felt she was losing ground and needed to escalate, or a sign that she felt she was winning and was consolidating. Eliza couldn't tell which. "I need to go see Eleanor," she said. "Now?" "Before I do anything else." Eleanor answered the door with the expression of someone who had been expecting a visitor. "I heard about the letter," Eleanor said, which was Eleanor's way of managing the first 5 minutes of any conversation. "How?" Eliza asked. "Charles Holloway came by to speak with me yesterday. He came by himself without Margaret. He wanted to know what I thought about the botanical knowledge question." Eliza sat down. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that I had eaten what you prepared in your presence, and it was good food gathered by someone who knew what they were doing." Eleanor poured tea without asking. "I also told him that Margaret was making an error she was going to find hard to walk back from." "What did he say?" He listened. Charles is a listener. He doesn't always act on what he hears, but he listens. Eleanor sat down across from Eliza. "He's worried about her." "Not about the program. About her." Eliza's absorbed that. The idea of Charles Holloway being worried about Margaret, worried enough to go speak privately with Eleanor Whitmore, suggested a dimension of the situation she hadn't had visibility into. "She's been to the Piercys," Eleanor said. "Again. Yesterday afternoon. Clara told me what for. Ostensibly to see how Thomas was doing. The boy is improving, by the way. Fever broke 2 days ago." Eleanor paused. Clara said, "Margaret spent the better part of an hour asking whether she'd given any more thought to where the fever came from." Eliza put down her tea. She went back to Clara Pierce after the doctor gave his report. "Yes, with Thomas improving." "Yes," Eleanor was watching her carefully. "You understand what that means." Eliza understood perfectly. The doctor's report had closed one door. Margaret was trying to find another. "She's not going to stop," Eliza said. "No," Eleanor said. "She's not. Not because she's malicious, necessarily. Because she's built herself into a position where being wrong is not survivable. So she can't afford to be wrong." Eliza looked at her hands. "What do I do?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. When Eleanor was quiet in a specific way, it meant she was going to say something she'd already decided to say, and was simply choosing the timing. "Committee meeting," Eleanor said. "The winter relief planning, it continues next week?" "Yes, I'll attend." Eliza looked up at her. "I haven't been to a community meeting in 4 years," Eleanor said. "My legs aren't what they were, but I'll manage the walk." She picked up her tea. "There are things I know about this valley that haven't been said in a public room in a long time. I think it might be time to say some of them." "Eleanor." "I'm not doing it for you," Eleanor said, in her flat, clarifying way. "I'm doing it because someone has built a case out of nothing and is about to propose that the county get involved, and the county doesn't need to be involved in this valley's private business. We can solve our own problems, we always have." Eliza sat with that. "There's something else you should know," Eleanor said. Something I didn't tell you when you came with Clara Pierce." Still, Eleanor turned her tea mug slowly in both hands. Outside, the wind was picking up again, rattling the window frames in the way of a valley winter that had made up its mind. "The seasonal fever," Eleanor said. "The one I described. I've seen it 5 times. The first time was 30 years ago. I had a neighbor, a woman who had been gathering wild plants from the creek for her family. When the fever hit the children that year, people blamed her. It was easier than understanding something they didn't understand." She paused. "She left the valley, took her family east. We lost something when she went, though most people didn't know what they'd lost until the next drought, and there was nobody who knew where to look." She looked at Eliza steadily. "I don't intend to watch that happen again," she said. Eliza sat in Eleanor's kitchen for a long time after that. Outside, the October wind moved across the frosted valley, and the creek ran cold and clear over its stones, indifferent to all of them. Inside, 2 women drank tea and understood each other in the particular way that women understand each other when they have both spent years being underestimated by the same general category of assumptions. When Eliza finally stood to go, Eleanor said, "Bring your journal to the meeting." "It's in a flour sack," Eliza said. "It's not impressive." "Bring it anyway. What's in it is impressive. The flour sack doesn't matter." Walking home, Eliza felt something she hadn't felt in 10 days, not confidence exactly, because the situation was still genuinely uncertain, and Margaret was still actively working against her, and the proposal to the county could still create real damage. But something directional, a sense of the shape of things, of where the weight was and where it wasn't, and what needed to be done. There would be a meeting. Eleanor would speak. The flour sack journal would sit on a table and contain, in its careful handwriting, the record of 6 weeks of gathered knowledge and shared work, and the names of every family who had participated. And the winter would come regardless. That was the thing Eliza kept coming back to. The winter was not waiting for Margaret Holloway's assessment, or the county agricultural officer's review, or the resolution of anyone's feelings about whether a farmer's daughter with a flour sack journal counted as a qualified source of knowledge. Cold was already in the ground. The crops were gone. The food that had been gathered was sitting in jars on shelves across the valley, real and present, and without any interest in the arguments surrounding it. She came home to find Nathan at the kitchen table, with a lamp lit against the early falling dark, going over the farm accounts. He looked up when she came in. "Eleanor's coming to the meeting," Eliza said. Something shifted in Nathan's face, not surprise, but a recalibration of what he'd been expecting the next few days to look like. "Then it'll matter," he said. "Yes," Eliza said, "I think it will." She hung her coat and began making supper, and through the window the last of the light went out of the sky above the bluffs, and the stars came up hard and cold. Somewhere in the valley, Thomas Pierce was sleeping off a fever that had nothing to do with wild plants, and Margaret Holloway was sitting with her stationery and her certainty, and Agnes Coles was, probably, sorting through dried herbs in a kitchen her husband didn't spend much time in, and the creek kept running. And there were still things in it, even now, even in the cold, that Eliza knew and could use and intended to teach to anyone who was willing to come and learn. The meeting was in 4 days. She wasn't going to waste the time. 4 days before the meeting did not pass quietly. Eliza had expected some version of continued pressure, more letters, more whisper campaigns, working through the valley's social channels, perhaps another visit to Clara Pierce. What she had not expected was the particular form the pressure took on the second day, which was a delegation. 3 women appeared at her door on Wednesday morning. Not hostile women, not Margaret's allies. These were women who had attended the lessons, whose families had benefited, who were now standing on her porch with the uncomfortable expression of people who have come to say something they would rather not say. Ellen Marsh was the one who spoke first, because Ellen Marsh always spoke first in any group. She was a practical woman, sharp-featured, who had come to the lessons late, but had learned fast and retained everything. "We've heard about the proposal," Ellen said. "The county officer review." "So have I," Eliza said. "Some of the women are worried it'll cause problems. Even if it comes to nothing, the process itself, the county getting involved, might make the men in certain households decide the lessons aren't worth the trouble." Eliza looked at the 3 of them. "Which households?" The second woman, Mary Forsyth, looked at her feet. "Mine, possibly. My husband's already uncomfortable. If there's an official inquiry attached to any of this—" "There isn't an inquiry," Eliza said. "Margaret has proposed requesting a review. That hasn't happened yet, and I don't believe it will." "But if it does," Ellen said. "If it does," Eliza said, "then I'll answer every question an agricultural officer asks me, and I'll answer them with 3 years of careful records." She looked at each of them in turn. "Are you asking me to stop teaching? Is that what this is?" "No," Ellen said quickly. "No, we're asking you to be careful." "I have been careful," Eliza said. "Everything I've taught has been accurate and safe." The doctor confirmed it. Eleanor Whitmore confirmed it. "I don't know what more careful looks like." The third woman, a quiet person named Sarah Jennings, who had barely spoken above a murmur in any of the sessions, but who Eliza had noticed was always the last to leave, always absorbing the last details, as she gathered her things, said, "What we're really asking is whether you're going to keep going. Because if you're going to stop, we need to know now so we can figure out the winter without counting on it." That was the honest question, and Eliza recognized it as such. "I'm not stopping," she said. Sarah Jennings nodded once. It was the nod of someone who had asked a question and received the only answer she was going to do something with. "Then we'll be there tomorrow morning," Sarah said. Ellen and Mary exchanged a look, and whatever they were negotiating in that look resolved toward the same direction. "We'll be there," Ellen said. They left. Eliza stood in the doorway and watched them walk down the road and felt the peculiar weight of being dependent on not an unpleasant feeling, but a heavy one. The kind that reminded you that your choices had edges, and those edges reached other people. She went inside and opened the flour sack journal and reviewed everything in it, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to hold the whole of it in her mind clearly before the meeting. On Thursday morning, the sessions resumed at full attendance. Not the reduced sessions of the past 2 weeks, the full group, plus Ruth Prather, who had been absent, plus 2 women. Eliza hadn't seen before, who had apparently been sent by their families to see what the lessons actually were. Eliza counted 14 women and 9 children at the old willow tree in the early morning cold. Taught. She taught with the same plainness she always used, the same lack of ceremony. She showed them what remained gatherable in early November, which was less than October, but more than people expected: certain roots, dried plants that hadn't been harvested earlier, the last of the rose hips along the upper banks section that she'd been intentionally leaving for exactly this moment. She taught them to look at what was still standing after the first hard frost and understand why it was still standing, what qualities in a plant made it cold resistant, what that meant for its likely nutritional density, how the same toughness that kept a plant alive through frost made it worth knowing. One of the new women, a heavy-set woman in her 40s named Constance, who had said nothing all morning, raised her hand near the end of the session. It was the gesture of someone unaccustomed to asking questions in a group setting, tentative at the wrist. "Yes," Eliza said. "My husband said I shouldn't come," Constance said. "He said there was talk about you." She paused. "I came anyway. I have 5 children." The group was quiet. "I'm glad you came," Eliza said. "Can you show me the root thing again?" "The cattail root. I didn't follow it the first time." Eliza showed her again. She showed her twice at Constance's pace, till Constance's hands knew the motion. That afternoon, Eliza sat with the flour sack journal and added entries for what had been gathered that morning, which families had participated, approximate volumes. She wrote it in her small, careful hand, the same way she'd written everything else in it, and she thought about Eleanor, saying, "Bring it anyway. Flour sack doesn't matter." And she thought about her father, who had written his own notes in the margins of seed catalogs and the backs of feed invoices, because that was what was available, and the information was more important than the container. Friday came with sleet. Not heavy, just the thin, miserable kind that coated everything in a layer of gray ice and made all outdoor work miserable. Nathan came in from the barn with his coat soaked and his jaw set against the cold, and sat by the stove and drank coffee and said nothing for a while in the particular silence that meant his body was recovering from something. "How's the stock?" Eliza asked. "Fine. Worse than fine if this keeps up." He looked at the window. "How are you?" It was not a question Nathan asked routinely. He was more a man of practical inquiry. "How's the work? What do we need? What's the plan?" The direct personal question was something he reserved for moments when he thought the answer mattered more than the slight awkwardness of asking. "I'm all right," she said. "The meeting's tomorrow." "I know. Eleanor's still planning to come, as far as I know." He was quiet again. Then, "I'm going to stand up and say something." She looked at him. "We talked about this. I know what we talked about. I'm saying it again. I've been watching this for weeks, and I have things I should have said sooner." He held her gaze. "Kept quiet because you're better at this than I am. Strategy of it. But there are things that a husband should say, and I haven't said them." Eliza did not tell him he was wrong. She understood what he was talking about, understood that there was a particular kind of statement that carried different weight coming from a man whose wife had been accused, and that Nathan's silence, however strategically sound, had been read in some quarters as absence of support rather than deference to his wife's judgment. "Say what you need to say," she told him. "Just don't make it a fight." "I never make fights," he said. "You make the edges of fights," she said. "And then other people finish them." He looked at her for a moment. Corner of his mouth moved, which on Nathan was a substantial expression. "Fair," he said. The meeting the following morning was set for 10 o'clock. Eliza was up before 5, which was not unusual for her, but which had a different quality this morning, not the peaceful early rising of someone going to the creek, but the restless wakefulness of someone whose mind had been running since before the sun was up. She dressed in the dark. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table with the flour sack journal open in front of her, not reading it, just looking at it. Nathan came downstairs at 6 and found her there, and did not say anything about it, which was one of the things she valued most about him, his ability to recognize when presence was what was needed rather than words. They ate breakfast. They dressed for the cold. They walked to the schoolhouse together, arriving at 9:30 to find it already filling. The room was different from the first committee meeting. That one had been organized, chairs arranged, people in their expected places, the social architecture of the meeting already established when people arrived. This one had a different energy, more bodies than before, people standing along the walls because the chairs were full. The word had gotten around about Eleanor's planned attendance, and Eleanor Whitmore's presence at any public gathering was sufficiently unusual that it had functioned as its own kind of announcement. Eleanor arrived at 10 minutes before the hour, walking with the careful deliberateness of someone whose legs required negotiation with the ground. Two women moved immediately to help her, and she accepted the assistance without fuss, which was Eleanor's particular way. With help, she took it when it was offered, without making a production of either the need or the acceptance. She sat in the front row. Margaret Holloway was at the front of the room with her ledger and her papers. She had seen Eleanor arrive. Her expression had not changed significantly, but Eliza, watching from the third row, saw the moment of recalibration, the slight settling of something behind Margaret's eyes as she revised her internal model of how this morning was going to go. Reverend Alderman called the meeting to order. He went through 2 items of routine business with the relieved efficiency of a man who wants the comfortable part to last as long as possible. Then he cleared his throat and said that Mrs. Holloway had requested time to present a proposal. Margaret stood. She presented the proposal clearly, as Eliza had known she would, because Margaret was nothing if not organized. She outlined the situation, the foraging program, the questions raised about safety, the community's need to be certain that information being shared among families met some standard of accountability. She proposed that the committee send a formal request to the county agricultural office asking for a qualified officer to review the program and provide guidance. She was reasonable throughout. She used the word accountability 4 times. She used the word community 6 times. She was concerned, she said, not with any individual, but with ensuring that the Valley's most vulnerable families, those with young children, those with elderly members, had access to information that had been properly verified. When she finished, Reverend Alderman asked if there were responses. Several people spoke. 2 were in favor of the proposal predictably, men who had resisted the program from the start, and who used the opportunity to voice general skepticism about foraging as a reliable food strategy. One woman carefully said she thought more information from an outside expert might be helpful. Then James Henderson stood up. James Henderson was a large, quiet man who farmed the North Parcel and who had, prior to the beetle summer, never paid any particular attention to Eliza Vance beyond the ordinary awareness of a neighbor. His wife, Margaret, a different Margaret, a small, quiet woman, everyone called Meg to avoid confusion, had been one of Eliza's earliest and most capable students. My family ate from the lessons, all through September and October, James said. He spoke slowly, choosing his words in the way of someone who doesn't speak in public often and wants to get it right. My children are healthy. My wife knows more about this land than she did before. I don't see what a county officer can tell us about whether that's been good for my family, because I can see it myself. He sat down. Then Bernard Coles stood up. The room tensed slightly, the way rooms tense when someone known for loud opinions gets to their feet. But Bernard did not say what several people were expecting. He stood for a moment, and something moved across his face, an internal conflict visible enough to be read from across the room, and he said, "My wife has been gathering since October. She didn't ask my permission after the first time. I wanted on record that she was right not to." He sat down quickly, as though having said it faster, he would be less committed to it. The room was very quiet. Agnes Coles was not present. Eliza didn't see her in the room. But Eliza understood in that moment what the basket on the doorstep had meant. It had not just been solidarity. It had been a woman doing what she knew was necessary and trusting that eventually her husband would come to the same conclusion. Agnes had known Bernard better than anyone. Nathan stood next. Eliza had told him not to make it a fight, and he didn't. He stood the way he always stood, solidly, without performance, and he said, "I spent 2 years thinking my wife was wandering. She wasn't wandering. She was learning something I didn't have the patience to learn, and building something I didn't have the foresight to build. Food that's in our cellar right now, that'll carry us through winter, is there because of what she knew and what she taught. I should have said that publicly before this, and I didn't, and that's on me." He paused. She doesn't need a county officer to verify what she knows. She needs people to listen to her. He sat down. Eliza did not look at him. Then Eleanor Whitmore stood. It took her a moment, and Constance, the woman with 5 children who had come to the lessons on Thursday, moved to help, and Eleanor accepted the hand and got upright, and stood there in the front row, and the room settled into the particular quality of silence that Eleanor's presence tended to produce. "I've lived in this valley for 51 years, Eleanor said. Her voice was not strong, but it was clear and it carried. "I've watched 5 seasons of the creek fever, 2 drought years, 1 flood, and a number of community arguments that looked important at the time." She paused. What Eliza Vance has been doing on those creek banks is what my husband's mother did for 20 years before either of us got here. What women in difficult places have always done when the official sources of food run short. They learn the land. They remember what the land can provide. They teach other people what they know. She looked around the room. The first time the fever came through, we blamed a woman who knew the creek plants. We lost her. The valley was poorer for it, and most of you don't know that because it happened before you arrived. She looked directly at Margaret. I don't intend to watch it happen a second time. She sat down. The room held the weight of that for a long moment. Then Eliza stood. She had not planned exactly what she was going to say. She had notes in her head, organized points, but standing in the room with all of it, Nathan's quiet words, Eleanor's 51 years, Bernard Coles's surprising 3 sentences, the women along the walls who had carried baskets to the creek. Through cold mornings, she set the organized points aside. She held up the flour sack journal. "This is what 3 years of paying attention looks like," she said. "It's not impressive to look at, but what's in it is accurate, and it's specific to this valley, and it was gathered from this land, and the families whose names are in it are not sick." She set it on the table at the front of the room. "If anyone wants to read it, it'll stay here after the meeting. County wants to review it, they're welcome to. There's nothing in it that doesn't stand up to examination." She looked at Margaret, not with anger, not with the accumulated weight of everything that had happened over the past week. Just directly, the way you look at someone when you want them to understand that you are still standing. "I am going to keep teaching," she said, "because the winter is coming and the food is there, and the people who need it deserve to know how to find it. What this room decides about county officers and reviews and proposals is the room's business. The teaching doesn't stop." She sat down. Reverend Alderman looked at the room. He looked at Margaret's proposal on the table in front of him. He was a man who moved toward the consensus that was forming rather than the one he'd arrived expecting, and the consensus in the room had shifted in a direction that he could read as clearly as anyone. "I'd like to table the proposal," he said carefully, pending further community discussion. Margaret started to respond and then stopped. Charles Holloway, who had been sitting 2 seats from his wife, put his hand briefly on her arm. It was a small gesture. She went still. She did not withdraw the proposal. But she didn't push against the tabling either. The meeting moved to other business. Eliza sat and listened and did not look at the flour sack journal on the table, though she was aware of it the whole time, aware of it the way you're aware of something you've worked on for a long time and finally set down in a public place. After the meeting, people moved around in the particular way of groups that have been through something and are redistributing themselves into smaller clusters to process it. Several people came to speak to Eliza briefly, practically, asking specific questions about what would be available to gather in November and whether she was planning sessions through the cold. She answered each one. James Henderson shook Nathan's hand. Bernard Coles walked past them both without stopping, but he nodded one short, unambiguous nod in Eliza's direction before he reached the door. Clara Pierce came and stood in front of Eliza with Thomas beside her. The boy looked pale but upright, the recovering fragility of a child whose fever has broken and whose energy has not fully returned. He was looking at the floor with the particular self-consciousness of someone who knows they are part of a situation that involved adults and serious words. "He wanted to come," Clara said. "He asked about the lessons." Eliza looked at Thomas. "You want to come back to the creek?" Thomas looked up. He had his mother's careful eyes. "My mama said you showed her how the cattail roots work." "I did. I want to learn that part," he said. "For the flour." "Then you come next Thursday," Eliza said, "and I'll show you." Clara put her hand on Thomas's shoulder. She looked at Eliza, and in that look was everything that hadn't been fully said between them over the past weeks. The fear, the terrible position of a mother who had unknowingly provided ammunition for something harmful, and now on the other side of it, the particular relief of knowing her child was better and the accusation was closed. "I'm sorry," Clara said quietly, "for what was said using Thomas as the reason." "You didn't say it," Eliza said. "What you said was that your son was sick, which was true." "I know who took it further," Clara said, "and I should have corrected it sooner." There was nothing useful Eliza could add to that, so she didn't add anything. She held Clara's gaze for a moment and then looked at Thomas and said, "Thursday. Don't be late. The light goes early now." Thomas nodded with the serious gravity of a child who has just received a real assignment. After Clara and Thomas left, Eliza turned and found Eleanor standing beside her, having navigated across the room on her own, apparently, while Eliza had been occupied. "The journal," Eleanor said. Eliza looked at the table. The flour sack journal was still there, and beside it stood Margaret Holloway, reading it. Eliza went still. Margaret was reading it, the way people read things they are genuinely reading, not skimming slowly, going back on some pages, her finger tracing certain lines. She had been standing there for several minutes, apparently. She had the expression of someone who is looking at something that is reorganizing their understanding of it. Eliza watched her. Eleanor at her elbow said nothing. Margaret turned another page. She stopped at a section Eliza recognized from across the room, the mid-September entries, where Eliza had cataloged the survival rates of different plants through the worst of the beetle infestation, specific notations about which plants the insects avoided, and why, the cross-references she'd built between plant characteristics and insect behavior that she'd developed over the drought summer of 1886. Margaret stood at that page for a long time. Then she closed the journal and looked up and found Eliza's eyes across the room. The expression on her face was not what Eliza had expected. It was not defeated, not hostile, not the managed control of someone maintaining a position under pressure. It was something she hadn't seen on Margaret Holloway before. Complicated. Complicated in a way that suggested something had shifted, or was shifted, somewhere in the architecture of the position Margaret had built. She set the journal down on the table carefully. She gathered her papers. She walked toward the door, and as she passed the row where Eliza was standing, she stopped. "You've been doing this since you arrived," Margaret said. Her voice was level. It was not an apology, and it was not an accusation. "Since the second year," Eliza said. "I didn't know," Margaret said. "I know," Eliza said. Something passed between them. Not resolution, not anything that was going to tidy up the past weeks into something clean, but a recognition, a seeing of something that hadn't been seen before, on both sides, and which couldn't now be unseen. Margaret walked to the door and left. Charles Holloway, passing behind her, gave Eliza a brief look, not apologetic, not explanatory, just the look of a man who had been watching something happen in his own house for weeks and was glad it had arrived somewhere. Eleanor beside Eliza said, "Well, is that good?" Eliza asked. "Something," Eleanor said. "Whether it's good depends on what she does with it." They left the schoolhouse together, walking out into the cold November air, with the sleet from Friday's weather still frozen in patches on the road. Eliza carried the flour sack journal under her arm. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked. "The teaching continues," Eliza said. "Whatever else happens, that continues." "I meant with Margaret." Eliza thought about that honestly. "I don't know," she said. "I think she needs time, and I think she paused. Choosing the words with care, I think. She's someone who needs to arrive at things herself. If I push toward her, she'll push back. If I stay where I am and let her come to it." "She might," Eleanor said, "or she might not." "Yes," Eliza said. "Either way." Eleanor made the sound that was either approval or skepticism. In the cold morning air, walking slowly to accommodate Eleanor's pace, it sounded more like the first one. They parted where the road forked Eleanor's house to the north, the Vance property south. Nathan had walked ahead, talking to James Henderson, and Eliza could see the two of them at the far end of the fork, their breath visible in the cold. Stood at the junction for a moment alone. The valley stretched out in front of her, the damaged fields, the brown and collapsed remains of the summer crops, the creek winding through its bare banks. The trees along the ridge were stripped of leaves. Everything looked, in the November cold, like something that was over. She knew better. Beneath the frozen ground, the root systems she'd been documenting for 3 years were intact. Cattail beds along the upper creek were dormant but alive. The rose hip bushes along the northern section were picked clean by now, but would flower again in spring. The lamb's quarter seeds had already scattered across 100 square yards of creek bank and would germinate when the soil warmed. The valley looked empty. It wasn't. She walked toward Nathan, who had seen her and was waiting, and she thought about Thomas Pierce, asking about cattail root flower, and about Constance, who had come despite her husband and wanted to be shown things twice, and about Agnes Coles's basket with no note, and about Eleanor saying, "I don't intend to watch it happen a second time." She thought about the flour sack journal sitting under her arm, with its careful records of everything the land had offered, and everything the valley had done with it. It was not a complete record. It never would be. The land kept offering things she hadn't found yet, and the valley kept changing. And knowledge was a living thing that grew or went dormant, depending on whether someone was tending it. Nathan fell into step beside her. "Henderson wants to talk to you," he said, "about setting up some kind of formal arrangement for sharing the foraging knowledge, mapping the creek resources, making it something the valley keeps track of properly. What did you tell him? That you'd talk to him, Nathan said. She looked at her husband. The cold had put color in his face, and he was looking straight ahead down the road toward home. And she thought about the afternoon she'd taken him to the creek and walked him through everything, and watched the expression move across his face as he understood, finally, what she'd been building. She thought about all the mornings he'd watched her walk out with her basket and said nothing, for all the complicated reasons. Men say nothing when they don't yet understand something. And all the mornings since the beetle summer when he'd walked with her, or worked alongside the preserving, or defended her at the well in his brief, flat, entirely Nathan way. All right, she said. I'll talk to Henderson. They walked on. Behind them, the schoolhouse sat quiet at the road's bend, and inside it the chairs were being put back, and the winter committee ledger was going into its satchel, and the flour sack journal was already in Eliza's arm. And whatever the valley was going to make of the next months was still being decided by the cold, by the food people had stored, by the knowledge that was now sitting in 14 households where it had not been sitting in September. The creek ran cold and full to the south. Eliza could hear it from the road faintly over the sound of the wind. She had not yet told Nathan about Henderson's proposal, had not yet thought through what a formal arrangement might look like, had not yet considered what it meant that the valley was moving slowly, imperfectly, through resistance and rumor, and the complicated business of people deciding to trust something they'd been mocking toward something that could outlast the current season. There would be time to think about all of that. First there was supper. First there was the jar of dried wood sorrel that needed resealing because the lid had started to lift. First there was the flour sack journal to update with today's date, and the names of everyone who had stood up in that schoolhouse and said the things they'd said. First there was the ordinary afternoon of a woman who had work to do and was not finished doing it. The winter was not going to wait. The Henderson conversation happened 4 days after the meeting at the Vance kitchen table, because that was where important conversations in Eliza's life always seemed to happen. James Henderson arrived with his hat in his hands and a directness that Eliza had come to appreciate about him. He was not a man who circled things. He sat down, accepted coffee, and said what he'd come to say. I want to map the creek, he said formally. Make a document the valley keeps. Mark where things grow when they come in, how much can be taken without damaging what's there. Something that doesn't live in one person's flour sack journal and disappear if that person moves away or gets sick. Eliza looked at him. You're worried about what happens to the knowledge if something happens to me, she said. I'm worried about what happens to the knowledge period, he said. This valley almost lost it once because people didn't take it seriously. If we'd had a proper record, something official, something in the schoolhouse alongside the agricultural registers, we wouldn't have spent August staring at ruined fields not knowing where else to look. He was right. Eliza had thought about this herself, in the way you think about something that you know needs to happen, but haven't found the right moment to push toward. What would it look like, she asked. That's what I was hoping you'd tell me, he said. Thought about it practically. A map of the creek, section by section. Seasonal inventories of what grew where. Preparation methods, storage methods, safety information. Kind of document you could hand to a family who had just arrived in the valley and have them know, within a season, what the land could offer beyond what they'd planted. She thought about the woman Eleanor had described, the one who had been blamed 30 years ago, the same seasonal fever, who had taken her knowledge east and left the valley poorer for it. She thought about all the knowledge that had never been written down because the people who held it had not been considered the kind of people whose knowledge merited documentation. It would take time, she said. A full year at minimum. You'd need all 4 seasons documented. Then we start now, Henderson said, and we have it done by next fall. Who oversees it? He looked at her steadily. You do. You and whoever you choose to work with. I'll provide the formal backing, present it to the committee as a community resource project. That gives it standing. It gives it standing, Eliza said, meaning it becomes harder for anyone to propose shutting it down. That, too, he said without apology. Nathan, who had been at the stove and had been quiet throughout, said, You'll need Eleanor involved. For the historical record. Henderson nodded. I'll go see her this week. After he left, Eliza sat for a while with the idea of it. A document, an official one. The knowledge written down and housed somewhere that wasn't a flour sack sewn together with carpet thread. She didn't feel triumphal about it. What she felt was something closer to the satisfaction of a long task, finally arriving at its right shape, not finished but properly begun. November deepened into its hardest weeks. The creek froze at the edges, leaving only a narrow running center. The valley roads turned to iron. Sky took on the flat white quality of cold that has settled in for a long time and is not going anywhere, and the temperature at night dropped far enough that the water in the livestock troughs needed breaking every morning before dawn. Lessons continued. Not at the creek, the ground there was too hard, and the pickings too thin for the full sessions. What continued was something different. Gathering groups that worked through the valley's existing stores, learning to identify and use what had already been collected, learning the preservation techniques that transformed autumn's abundance into winter's resource. Eliza held sessions in her kitchen, in the Miller kitchen, twice in the Prather house, where there was a large worktable good for spreading out dried plants for identification practice. Thomas Pierce came on the first Thursday in November, as she'd told him to, and stood at the kitchen table with the serious attention of a child who has been given a real task and intends to do it properly. His mother came with him. They stayed 2 hours. Thomas went home knowing the difference between safe and unsafe cattail root preparation, which was more than most adults in the valley had known before August. Came back the following week with a friend children. Eliza was discovering we're better at this than adults in certain respects. They didn't carry the weight of having to revise their prior understanding of what the land was for. They simply looked at what was in front of them and learned it, without the complicated internal negotiation that adults required. She started setting aside time, specifically for the children. Ruth Prather's eldest daughter, who was 11, and had her mother's practical attention, became one of the most reliable attendees. By December, she could identify 14 plants by sight and knew the preparation method for 9 of them. Eliza caught herself thinking, more than once, that in 10 years that girl would know more about the creek than almost anyone in the valley. That thought carried something important in it. She wasn't sure she'd fully understood, before this winter, what teaching actually was. She'd thought of it as transfer. You had knowledge. Someone else needed it. You moved it from one place to another. That was part of it. But watching Ruth's daughter and Thomas Pierce and the other children absorb things so quickly and then do something unpredictable with what they'd absorbed, combining it, questioning it, finding connections she hadn't pointed toward, she understood that the knowledge was not moving from one place to another. It was growing. Each person who held it held a slightly different version, shaped by their own attention and situation, and the total of it became more than what she'd started with. Her father would have understood this. Her father, who had written in margins and on feed invoices, who had taught her everything he knew with the urgency of someone trying to ensure that a thing not die with him. Her father had always been trying to do this thing that she was only now understanding the shape of. She wrote that down in the flour sack journal late one December night by lamplight, in the margin beside an entry about cattail preparation. Not for anyone else, just because it was true and she wanted to remember it. December brought the first real test. Not a crisis, nothing as dramatic as the beetle summer, no single event that crystallized things. Just the slow, grinding pressure of a hard winter on families whose food stores were thinner than they'd hoped, who were stretching what they had in ways that required creativity and stubbornness and the willingness to eat things they wouldn't have eaten a year ago. The Jennings family, Sarah Jennings, the quiet woman from the early lessons, and her husband and 4 children ran short on grain in the 3rd week of December. It was not a catastrophic shortage, but it was real. They came to Eliza not with embarrassment, but with a practical question. What did she have that could supplement what they were missing? And what could they gather now, in the frozen creek margins, that would help stretch what remained? Eliza went through her stores with Sarah. She gave what she could give without creating a shortage for her own household dried lamb's quarter. Cattail flour, preserved rose hips, a quantity of dried herb mixture that added nutrition to soups and stews. She also told Sarah what to look for on the south-facing creek banks, where the freeze was shallower and certain fruits were still accessible. Sarah came back 2 days later with her husband, who had clearly needed time to arrive at the position of accepting help, and who sat at Eliza's kitchen table with the look of a man who has negotiated something internally and come out the other side of it. "I want to learn," he said. "Whatever you're teaching the women, I want to learn it." Eliza looked at him. He was in his late 30s, weathered by farming in the way that men who work outside get weathered, and he was looking at the table with the particular downward attention of someone who has said something that cost them something. "Sessions are Thursday mornings," she said. He came on Thursday. He was not the only man who came that month. Henderson had been quietly influential in making it acceptable, Having stood up in the committee meeting and spoken about his own family's experience, he had done something that shifted the social calculus for other men, who now had a model for how to participate without it being a declaration of weakness. 3 men attended sessions in December. By January, there were 5. Bernard Coles was not among them. But Agnes came reliably every session, and Bernard had stopped making the comments at the well that had characterized his earlier position. He'd gone quiet on the subject, which in Ash Hollow was its own kind of statement. Christmas came and went quietly. The valley marked it in the usual ways, with the usual gatherings, and the food at those gatherings included things that had not been on any Ash Hollow Christmas table before preparations from the wild harvest, incorporated now so naturally into the ordinary meal that several people who had not been to the lessons didn't realize what they were eating until someone mentioned it. Eliza noticed this. She said nothing about it. It was, she thought, exactly right. The knowledge becoming ordinary was the point. The knowledge becoming something that didn't require acknowledgement or defense, because it was simply part of how the valley fed itself. That was what success looked like. Not a ceremony, not a vindication, just lamb's quarter at the table, and nobody making a production of it. January was brutal. The temperature dropped in the second week and stayed dropped. Creek froze completely across its width, which it did only rarely, and which produced a particular silence where the sound of water had been a silence that felt like the landscape was holding its breath. 3 families in the valley came genuinely close to short, not the Vances, not the households that had been gathering and preserving since September, but families on the margins, a recently widowed man on the east parcel who had managed his own store badly and was too proud to ask for help until the situation was nearly critical, a young couple who had arrived in the valley in October and had no stores at all, a family whose root cellar had flooded in November and destroyed half of what they'd put up. Committee organized relief for all 3. The relief included food from Eliza's documented stores and from the stores of the families who had gathered a contribution that was now formally cataloged in the Community Resource Project that Henderson had put before the committee and that had been approved without significant opposition, partly because Margaret Holloway had not been present at the meeting where it was voted on, and partly because the practical necessity of it was too obvious by January for anyone to argue against. The widower, a man named Garrett, who had lost his wife in September and was managing his farm and his grief and his own stubbornness simultaneously, was the hardest case. He refused the first offer of help. He refused the second. He accepted on the third visit, which was made by Eleanor Whitmore herself, who arrived at his door in January cold and did not give him the option of turning her away with any dignity intact. Eleanor told Eliza about it afterward with the dry satisfaction of someone who has won an argument she expected to win. He took the food, Eleanor said. He also cried, which I pretended not to see. Was he all right? He will be, Eleanor said. He needed someone to make it easy to accept help. That's what most people need. Eliza thought about that long after the conversation ended. The mechanics of help, how you offer it so it can be accepted, how you make the receiving of it carry as little cost to someone's dignity as possible. She had understood this as instinctively, she thought, when she'd made Ruth Prather tea before she'd started teaching her anything. But she hadn't had the language for it until Eleanor named it. That, too, went into the journal margin. February arrived with a thaw that was premature and brief 3 days of temperatures above freezing that produced mud and false hope before the cold locked back down hard in the second week. But those 3 days were enough for the first signs of early growth along the south-facing creek banks, and Eliza walked out on the second day of the thaw and crouched in the mud and found, pushing up through the softened ground with the particular determination of things that have been waiting, the first shoots of early spring greens. Stood up and looked at them for a long time. She thought about the August morning she'd walked Nathan to the creek and named everything that was growing. She thought about how he'd asked how long she'd known, and she'd said since the second year, and she thought about the look on his face, the complicated, reordering look of a man understanding something he should have understood earlier. She had not been angry at him for not seeing it sooner. She had understood, without it being simple, that he'd been doing his best with the tools he had. She thought about what the valley had been in August and what it was now. Not transformed, not repaired. The crops were still ruined. Stores that should have existed didn't. The beetle damage had been real and the loss had been real. And there would be families in Ash Hollow who felt the financial consequences of the summer of 1888 for years. No one had starved. Not one family in Ash Hollow had gone without food through the winter. Not in the end. The combination of the community stores, the relief effort, the wild harvesting, and most importantly, the knowledge that was now sitting in multiple households, in multiple pairs of hands, that could be used next year, and the year after, and the year after that, had been enough. Enough was not the same as plenty. Eliza was clear on that. Enough was what you had when you'd done the work, and paid attention, and been willing to learn from what the land was trying to tell you. Plenty was luck and good weather in the absence of disaster. Enough was what you built. She crouched back down in the mud and began gathering the first early shoots, moving carefully to take only what she needed and leave what she didn't. It was March when Margaret Holloway came to the door. Eliza was not expecting her. The morning had been ordinary a session earlier, then preserving work in the kitchen, then the accounts she'd been helping Nathan with, now that spring planning had started, and the numbers needed organizing. She heard the knock and opened the door and found Margaret standing on the porch in her good coat, which was the coat she wore for formal occasions or situations she had decided required a particular presentation of herself. She looked older than she had in August. Not significantly, not in a way that was dramatic, just the way people look after a difficult season, when the cold and the worry have done small, persistent work on a face. "Mrs. Vance," she said. "Mrs. Holloway," Eliza said. "Come in." There was a moment where it was clear that Margaret had expected to do this on the porch and had not anticipated being invited inside. Came in, because the alternative was rude, and she stood in Eliza's kitchen and looked at the jars on the shelves, and the drying herbs, and the flour sack journal sitting on the table where Eliza had been updating it. Eliza did not offer tea. This was not hostility, it was instinct. Tea meant a long conversation. She wasn't sure yet what length this conversation needed to be. "I want to say something," Margaret said. She held her hands in front of her, folded in the way Eliza had come to associate with people who were trying to maintain composure while doing something hard. "I'd like to say it without interruption, if possible." "Go ahead," Eliza said. Margaret looked at the window, then at the jars, then finally at Eliza. "I was wrong about you," she said. "Not about everything. I still think there are ways the community should have been involved in what you were doing from the beginning. And I think working outside existing structures creates problems. Those are procedural concerns." She paused. "What I did was not a procedural concern. The accusation in the store. The letters, I didn't write them personally, but I know who did, and I did nothing to stop them. Proposal to the county. All of it was." She stopped again. Started again. "I was threatened by you. That's the honest version. You had something that I didn't have and couldn't organize around, and I couldn't stand that, and I tried to take it from you." The kitchen was very quiet. Eliza looked at this woman who had caused her weeks of the most sustained difficulty she'd experienced in her years in Ash Hollow. She looked at her directly, without the management she'd been applying to her own responses throughout the fall, without the strategic distance she'd maintained to avoid giving Margaret a target. She thought about what Eleanor had said. She can't afford to be wrong. She thought about what it had cost Margaret to stand in this kitchen and say the things she'd just said. "I know you were threatened," Eliza said. "I understood it fairly early." Something shifted in Margaret's face. "You did? You've been the person in this valley who knows what families need and coordinates the response. That's real work, and it matters. And then a beetle swarm came, and I turned out to have something you couldn't coordinate around." She paused. "I don't think I understood before this year that what I was doing could look like a threat. I wasn't building it to be one." "I know that now," Margaret said. "I didn't know it then." A silence between them that was not entirely comfortable but was honest, which was better than comfortable in Eliza's accounting. "The woman Eleanor mentioned," Margaret said. "The one who left the valley 30 years ago. Eleanor told me about her after the meeting." She looked down at her folded hands. "I didn't know about her, neither did I," Eliza said, "until Eleanor told me." "I keep thinking about it," Margaret said. "What the valley lost. What I almost..." She stopped. "But didn't," Eliza said. "This time, it didn't happen." Margaret looked up. Her eyes were bright in a way that was not quite tears, but was close to them. "No, this time it didn't." Eliza thought about what to do with this moment. She thought about forgiveness as a concept, not the religious architecture of it, which she'd always found too structured, but the practical reality of what you did with the space after someone who had hurt you had acknowledged it. You didn't owe anyone a clean slate. She believed that. You weren't required to pretend a thing hadn't happened because an apology had been offered. The pretending wasn't honest, and it didn't actually help anyone. But you could decide with full awareness of what had happened, what you wanted the relationship to look like going forward. Not because you'd forgotten or forgiven in the sense of erasing, because you'd chosen. I'd like your help with something, Eliza said. Margaret looked at her, clearly surprised. The Community Resource Project. Creek mapping. Henderson is overseeing it officially, but what it needs is someone who can make sure every family in the valley actually engages with it, knows it exists, knows how to use it. She held Margaret's gaze. That's organizational work. That's your strength, not mine. The surprise on Margaret's face deepened into something more complex. She was reading the offer, understanding it in all its layers, not just the practical request, but what it meant that it was being made at all, by this woman, in this kitchen, after everything. You'd want me involved, Margaret said. I'd want the valley to have both of us involved, Eliza said, which is a different thing. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. I'll need to understand what you've gathered, the full scope of it. I'll give you the journal, Eliza said. The whole thing. You can read it, and we can talk through whatever you have questions about. The flour sack, Margaret said, and something happened at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but something in that direction. It's what was available, Eliza said. The information is the same regardless. Margaret left 20 minutes later with the flour sack journal under her arm. Eliza stood in the doorway and watched her go. She did not feel the particular warmth of a reconciliation the way stories sometimes describe it, that clean, settling warmth of a conflict resolved. What she felt was more complicated and less comfortable. Relief mixed with wariness, the satisfaction of a practical decision mixed with the full awareness that Margaret Holloway was not a simple woman, and this was not the end of complication between them. But it was a beginning of something different, and beginnings were worth more than endings, in Eliza's experience. Nathan came in from the barn as Margaret's retreating figure disappeared around the road's bend. He looked at the empty doorway where Eliza was standing. Margaret Holloway, he said, not a question. She came to apologize, Eliza said. He was quiet for a moment, and I asked her to help with the creek mapping project. Nathan looked at her for a long, flat moment. Then he shook his head once, not in disagreement, but in the particular motion that meant he had just watched his wife do something that would have taken him years to arrive at and had done it in the space of a morning. You're a strange woman, he said. I know, she said. I mean that as a compliment, I know that too. Spring came properly in April. Creek unfroze entirely in the second week, the water running high and cold with snowmelt from the bluffs, and the south banks erupted with early growth, in a way that Eliza had been anticipating since February, and which still, even after years, produced in her something she could only describe as relief, the specific relief of watching something you'd trusted come through. She went to the creek on the first morning that the ground was soft enough to walk comfortably, and she went alone, which was rare now. She went early before the sessions, before the day organized itself into its various demands. She walked the full length she usually walked, from the old willow to the upper bend, naming things as she went the way she always had not allowed. But in her mind, the running inventory that was as natural to her now as breathing. Lamb's Quarter coming in thick along the northern section. Wood sorrel in the sheltered bends, the bright lemony green of it startling against the gray-brown of everything else. Cattails sending up their first new shoots along the soft mud of the bank. Crouched at a place where 3 plants she'd documented were growing within arm's reach of each other, and just looked at them for a while. Thought about the woman on these banks 30 years ago who had known all of this and been driven out for it. Thought about the knowledge that had left with her, and the drought years that had come after, and the people who had missed something they didn't know they'd lost. She thought about the flour sack journal, which Margaret had returned 2 days ago, with careful notes written on 3 separate sheets of paper attached organizational notes. A framework for how the creek mapping could be structured so that families who had never attended a single session could still navigate it. The notes were thorough. They were, Eliza had to acknowledge, better than anything she would have produced on her own. Margaret thought in systems. Eliza thought in specifics. Between the two of them, the document that was taking shape had both. She thought about Thomas Pierce, who had been coming every Thursday and who had developed, in the way of children who find the thing that suits them, a particular gift for root identification, for the feel of the ground above a root, for the subtle signals in the soil that told you what was under it. He was 9 years old. He had decades of springs ahead of him on these banks. She thought about Nathan, who had suggested the previous week that they expand the section of the Vance property nearest the creek into a kind of demonstration area, a place where some of the wild plants could be encouraged to grow in accessible conditions, where families new to the valley could learn in a more controlled setting before moving to the full creek walk. It was a practical suggestion delivered in Nathan's practical way, but she'd heard in it what it represented: her husband putting his land behind her work, publicly and permanently. She had said yes without deliberating. She thought about Eleanor Whitmore, who was slowing. The winter had taken something from Eleanor's legs that hadn't fully come back with the spring, and she was walking with a stick, now that she hadn't been using in November. Eleanor had asked Eliza, in a conversation that had been direct enough that Eliza had felt it land with all its weight, to make sure that someone else was learning what Eleanor knew, the 51 years of valley knowledge, the history of the creek, the names and stories and context that no written document could fully contain. "You mean I should be recording your knowledge?" Eliza had said. "I mean, you should be learning it," Eleanor had said. "You and the Henderson girl and that Pierce boy. However many people you can get. Because when I go, everything in my head goes with me, and I'd like to delay that particular loss." They had started that too. Weekly. Eleanor at her kitchen table with tea, talking, and Eliza with a new journal proper bound, bought at the general store, no flour sack this time, writing down everything. Stood up from the creek bank, her knees muddy, the early spring cold still enough to sting through her coat. Behind her, she could hear voices on the road, the session attendees arriving, the familiar sound of women and a few men and children collecting at the old willow. She turned and looked at them. Ruth Prather was there with both her eldest daughters now, the younger one just old enough for the sessions this spring. Constance, the woman with 5 children who had come despite her husband and asked to be shown things twice, was there and had brought her 2 oldest boys. Sarah Jennings was there with her husband, who attended every week without fail now, and who had developed into one of the most knowledgeable gatherers in the group. He had the patience for it that some people had, and others didn't. James Henderson was there, which was unusual for a morning session, and he had a young man with him. Eliza didn't recognize who he introduced as his nephew, newly arrived in the valley. Donna Miller was there, as she was every week, with the same set jaw she brought to everything and the same rapid, accurate learning she'd always displayed. Thomas Pierce was there without his mother, which meant he'd walked the 1.5 miles from the Pierce property alone, which meant Clara had decided he was old enough to do it, which struck Eliza as a small and complete thing. And at the edge of the group, standing slightly apart in the way of someone who is not quite sure of their welcome, but has come anyway, Margaret Holloway. She had told Eliza she wanted to attend a session. She had said it in the practical organizational way. She said things she needed to understand what was being taught in order to help structure how it would be disseminated. That was the stated reason, and it was probably partly true. She had come. Eliza walked toward the group. She stopped beside Margaret briefly. "You can walk with me," she said, "or you can observe. Either way is fine." "I'll walk," Margaret said. They went to the creek together. Eliza began the session the way she always began it, not with instructions, not with a preamble, but by pointing at something growing and naming it and explaining why it mattered. Lamb's quarter, first of the season, the leaves still small and tender enough that they could be eaten raw or cooked quickly. She explained the identification, the habits, the yield, the preparation. She answered the questions that came from Constance's boys, from Henderson's nephew, from Ruth's younger daughter, who had inherited her mother's directness, and asked things without preamble. Margaret asked one question the whole session. It was a good question, specific, practical, about how to identify the difference between 2 similar-looking plants that grew in proximity near the upper bend. It was the question of someone who had read Eliza's journal carefully and identified a point that needed clarification. Eliza answered it without ceremony. Margaret listened and nodded and wrote something in the small notebook she'd brought. Afterward, walking back along the bank, Thomas Pierce fell into step beside Eliza. "The Lamb's quarter is bigger this year," he said, "than last year." Eliza looked at him. "How do you know what last year looked like?" "You wrote it in the journal. The size of the leaves in early spring." I looked it up. She looked at him for a moment. He was 9 years old, and he had gone and found her records and compared them to what he was seeing. "It probably got better. Because we've been taking sustainably," she said. "Not over-harvesting. The plants are healthier." He thought about that. "So the more careful you are, the more there is." "Usually," she said. "Not always. But usually," he nodded, processing. "I told my dad that," he said. He said it made sense, but he wasn't sure he believed it. "Does he want to come see?" Thomas looked up at her. "Sessions are Thursday," she said. "Tell him I said so." Thomas Pierce walked home with what Eliza had learned over this year to recognize as the particular walk of a child carrying information they intend to do something with a slightly faster pace, a quality of forward intention. She watched him go. The valley spread out around her in the April morning, still damaged in the long-term financial sense, still carrying the weight of a terrible summer and a hard winter. The fields would need replanting, and the stores would need rebuilding, and none of the practical difficulties of farming in a difficult landscape had been resolved by anything that had happened. The creek banks were green. The knowledge was in 14 households and growing. The Flour Sack Journal had become a formal community document with a proper binding, and Margaret Holloway's organizational system attached to it. Eleanor's memories were being written down every week. Thomas Pierce knew what his mother had learned, and was learning more. Henderson's nephew would know by summer what it had taken Eliza 3 years to accumulate, because the learning was faster when someone walked you through it. The knowledge was not going to leave the valley. That was what had changed. Not the land, not the difficulty of living on it, not the human tendency to mock what they didn't understand or fear what threatened their idea of how things ought to be ordered. Those things were unchanged and would remain unchanged because they were part of what people were, reliably, regardless of season. But the knowledge was staying. Eliza thought about what her father had believed, that knowledge was a tool, and you handed it over because it was useful and because it was wrong to let it rust. She thought about how she had spent 3 years building something that no one saw, that no one valued, that everyone considered at best a mild eccentricity and at worst a sign of a woman who didn't understand her place. She thought about the morning in the general store with Margaret's words still ringing and the women looking at their shoes. Thought about what it had taken to stay, to not pack the knowledge up and go east, the way the woman 30 years ago had gone east, taking everything with her because the valley hadn't deserved to keep it. She had stayed, not because she was saintly, not because she was endlessly patient, not because the community had earned it. She had stayed because the creek was here, and the plants were here, and the families were here, and she had made a decision, somewhere in the weeks of the rumor, and the letters, and the terrible committee meetings. She was not going to let other people's fear determine the boundaries of her usefulness. That was the thing nobody had given her. She'd had to give it to herself. She had not done it gracefully. She had done it on the nights when she'd sat at the kitchen table and said things to Nathan she wouldn't have said to anyone else. She had done it through the mornings of going alone to the creek when no one came. She had done it with muddy knees and a flour sack journal and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had decided that what she knew was real, regardless of whether anyone around her had decided to recognize it yet. The world she had come to understand did not generally recognize the value of knowledge until it was needed. Until the beetles came, or the flood, or the fever, or whatever particular shape of disaster the season had in store. And by then, it was almost too late to build the knowledge from scratch. You needed someone who had started before the disaster, in the ordinary unremarkable days when nobody was paying attention and the creek banks just looked like weed tangle. You needed someone who was willing to be the strange girl wandering the creek. Turned and walked back toward the house. Nathan was on the porch, watching the session attendees disperse along the road. He had a cup of coffee in his hand and the look of a man who was simply present, not working, not planning, just standing in the spring morning watching the world his wife had helped change go about its business. She came up the porch steps and stood beside him. "Good session," he asked. "Thomas Pierce is going to know more than I do in 10 years, she said. Nathan considered that. "Is that a problem?" "No," she said. "That's exactly what it's supposed to be." He handed her the coffee. They stood together on the porch while the last of the session attendees made their way down the road with their baskets. In the clear April morning, in the valley where no one had starved, and the creek was running, and the lamb's quarter was already coming in thicker than last year. Eliza looked at the green line of the creek banks in the distance and thought, this is what enough looks like. Not plenty, not the resolution of all difficulty. Just this, the knowledge in good hands, the winter behind them, the spring doing what spring does, whether anyone is paying attention or not. She had paid attention. That had been the whole of it, in the end. The willingness to notice what everyone else walked past. The willingness to learn from what was already there, on the land, in the people around her, in the season itself. The willingness to stay strange in a world that found strangeness uncomfortable. Because the strangeness was just what it looked like from the outside, when someone was paying a different kind of attention than the people watching them. She had not saved the valley because she was exceptional. She had saved the valley because she'd kept her eyes open when it was easier to look away. That, she thought, was something anyone could do. The coffee was good. The morning was cold and clear. Down the road, Thomas Pierce was walking home with his fast, forward-intentioned walk, and somewhere in that walk was the next 30 years of this valley's knowledge of itself, accumulating one careful step at a time. Creek kept running. The spring kept coming. That was enough.